The 22-year-old girl sat huddled on the bathroom floor, blood running down her cracked lip and down her chin, while the sound of furniture being smashed echoed from the next room. Her trembling hands opened the old phone hidden under a loose brick. Only one number was saved, the number of the city's most notorious mafia boss, whom she hadn't heard from in 5 years. But tonight, as she walked heavily toward the bathroom door, she pressed the call. And when he picked up the phone, the sound of a car door slamming was heard from the other end of the line. Hey guys, please follow this story until the end. Like and comment on the name of the city you're watching so I know how far the story has gone. The rain didn't fall on Blackwater City that night. It attacked. Sheets of water hammered the cracked windows of the Greystone apartments like something furious was trying to get inside. The building sat on the south edge of the Narrows. 6 stories of stained concrete and rusted fire escapes wedged between a shuttered liquor store and a check-cashing place with bars thick enough to stop a truck. Half the units were empty. The other half held people who'd learned to stop calling the police a long time ago. Unit 4C was on the 4th floor. The hallway outside it smelled like mildew and old cooking grease, and something sharper underneath, something chemical that burned the back of the throat. A fluorescent tube buzzed overhead, throwing sick yellow light across water-stained carpet. Through the thin walls, the sounds were unmistakable. A man's voice, raw and wrecked with rage, screaming words that had stopped making sense 20 minutes ago. The crash of something heavy, a chair, maybe a table, splintering against drywall. Then a different sound, a softer one, the kind that made the neighbor in 4B turn up his television and stare at the screen with dead eyes. Inside the apartment, Celine Vale sat on the bathroom floor with her back pressed against the bathtub, knees pulled to her chest. She was 22 years old, but in that moment she looked like something smaller and older at the same time, like a child who'd already lived too long. Her lower lip was split open where Garrett's fist had caught her 10 minutes ago, and the blood had run down her chin and dripped onto the front of her gray t-shirt in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, almost artistic, if you were the kind of person who found art in the wrong places. Her left eye was swelling shut. Not all the way yet, but enough that the bathroom's single bare bulb had become a blurred smear of white in her peripheral vision. In the next room, Garrett Hale was destroying what was left of the kitchen. She could track his movements by sound alone. The shriek of a drawer being ripped from its runners. The detonation of plates hitting the floor. His boots grinding the broken pieces into linoleum. He was talking to himself now, or talking to her through the wall, a stream of accusations and threats that blurred together into one long, shapeless noise. Something about money. Something about respect. Something about how she thought she was better than him, how she looked at him like he was nothing, how she made him do this. Celine closed her good eye and pressed her forehead against her knees. She'd stopped crying 45 minutes ago. Not because the pain had faded or the fear had gone anywhere, but because her body had simply run out of whatever fuel crying required. What replaced it was worse. A flatness. A gray, humming emptiness that sat in her chest like a dead battery. She thought about the window. 4th floor. The alley below was concrete and dumpsters. She'd looked at it before, more than once, measuring the distance the way a person measures a doorway they're not sure they can fit through. She never went further than looking. But the looking itself had become a habit, and habits like that were their own kind of gravity. Not tonight. Tonight her mind went somewhere else. Somewhere she'd promised herself she would never go again. Her fingers found the loose floor tile beneath the sink vanity. She'd pried it up 3 months ago when Garrett was passed out drunk, using a butter knife that bent in the middle. The tile shifted with a gritty scrape. Underneath it, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a phone. Not a smartphone. A cheap burner with a cracked screen and a battery she charged once a month at the laundromat 2 blocks down, always when Garrett was out, always with her hands shaking. There was one contact saved in it. No name. Just a number she'd memorized 5 years ago and never been able to forget. The way the body remembers the location of a wound long after the scar has faded. Lucien Moretti. The name alone carried weight that could crush a room. In Blackwater City, people didn't say it casually. They said it the way sailors in old stories said the name of whatever lived at the bottom of the ocean. With fear, with a kind of superstitious respect, and with the absolute understanding that speaking it aloud could summon something you couldn't control. Lucien ran the Moretti Syndicate, had run it since his father bled out in a warehouse on the East Docks 12 years ago. shot 6 times by men who were found floating in the harbor a week later. At 34, Lucien controlled the Port Authority, the construction unions, 3 city council seats, and a network of legitimate businesses that stretched from Blackwater to the state capital. The newspapers called him a businessman. The police called him untouchable. The people who worked for him called him nothing at all, because the smart ones knew that drawing his attention was the same as drawing his judgment, and Lucien's judgment was final. Celine had met him once, 5 years ago, when she was 17 and her older brother Marcus was still alive. Marcus had worked for the Moretti organization, mid-level, nothing glamorous, running logistics for shipments that moved through the docks at night. He'd brought Celine to a party at Ravencrest Estate once, told her to stay close and not talk to anyone. She'd stood in a corner of a marble-floored ballroom holding a glass of water, watching men in expensive suits talk in low voices. And then Lucien had walked past. He'd stopped, looked at her. Not the way men usually looked at her, not with hunger or calculation, but with something closer to recognition, as if he were seeing a face he already knew in a place he didn't expect to find it. "Marcus's sister," he'd said. Not a question. "Yeah. You look like him." That was the whole conversation. 3 sentences. And then Marcus was dead 4 months later, and Celine's life had collapsed like a building with its foundation pulled out, and she'd never spoken to Lucien Moretti again. Until now. In the next room, Garrett's voice dropped to a lower register. That was worse than the screaming. The low voice meant he was coming down from the rage and entering something colder, something more deliberate. The screaming was chaos. The low voice was decisions. She heard his footsteps cross the living room. Pause. Start again, moving toward the hallway, toward the bathroom. Celine's thumb hovered over the call button. Her heartbeat was so loud it seemed to fill the small bathroom like a second person's breathing. She thought about what making this call meant, what it would cost, what it would summon into her life. But then Garrett's hand hit the bathroom door. Not a knock. A slap, open-palmed, hard enough to rattle the frame. "Open the door, Celine." His voice was calm now, almost gentle. That was the most terrifying version of him. "I'm not going to say it again." She pressed call. It rang 3 times. Each ring felt like a year. She was dimly aware that she was holding the phone with both hands, because one hand alone couldn't keep it steady. The split in her lip had opened wider, and she could taste copper at the back of her throat. The line connected. Silence. Not dead silence. She could hear ambient sound on his end. The low hum of an engine. Music, barely there. Something classical that seemed obscene against the backdrop of her bathroom floor. "Who is this?" The voice was low, unhurried, and carried the particular stillness of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Celine opened her mouth. What came out was not the speech she'd planned, not the explanation, not the careful words. What came out was the ragged, broken sound of a person who had been holding herself together for so long that the act of asking for help shattered every wall at once. "Please." Her voice cracked on the word. "Come get me." Another silence. Longer this time. She could hear him breathing, slow, measured, controlled. Then, "Celine." He said her name like he'd been expecting this call for 5 years. Like he'd kept the number active and the phone charged for exactly this moment. Like somewhere in the machinery of his ruthless, calculated mind, there had always been a contingency plan for the night Marcus Vale's little sister called him from a bathroom floor with blood on her teeth. "Where are you?" "Greystone, 4C. Garrett hit the door again, harder. The lock, a cheap interior lock, the kind you could open with a coin, groaned. "Celine, I swear to—" 17 minutes, Lucien said, and the line went dead. She didn't know what 17 minutes meant until later. She didn't know that Lucien had been at a meeting in a high-rise 3 miles north, sitting across from 2 port commissioners discussing a shipping contract worth $11 million. She didn't know that he'd stood up from that table mid-sentence, walked out of the room without explanation, and made 4 phone calls before his driver had pulled the car around. She didn't know any of that. All she knew was that the phone went silent, and she was alone again on the bathroom floor, and Garrett was going to come through that door. He did. About 3 minutes later, after she refused to answer 2 more times, he hit the door with his shoulder, and the lock gave on the second try, the door frame splintering at the strike plate with a crack that sounded like a bone breaking. Garrett Hale was 26, 6'1", and built like someone who'd spent years in manual labor and supplement-fueled gym sessions. He had a face that might have been handsome once, but had been coarsened by cheap alcohol and cheaper anger into something perpetually clenched. His knuckles were raw. Not from hitting her. He'd been punching the kitchen counter after she'd gone down, working out the remaining voltage of his rage on granite and particle board. He stood in the doorway and looked down at Celine on the floor. She watched his jaw work, watched the muscles in his neck shift, beneath skin flushed dark with adrenaline. "You call someone?" "No." "Don't lie to me." He said it quietly, conversationally, like they were discussing groceries. "I heard you talking." "I wasn't talking. You were what?" The silence between them was its own kind of violence. Celine slid the burner phone behind her back. She felt the cracked screen press against the tile. Her good eye found his and held steady, even though everything inside her was screaming to look away, curl up, become invisible. "I wasn't talking to anyone, Garrett." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was the worst thing she'd ever seen on a human face. A smile that contained no warmth, no humor, nothing recognizable as joy. It was a predator's smile, a claiming gesture. "Come here." "No." The smile vanished. He took one step into the bathroom. His boot came down on a piece of broken mirror that had fallen from the cabinet he'd smashed an hour ago. The glass crunched under his heel. "I said come here." Outside, somewhere far below the building, she heard it. Faint at first, then building. The sound of multiple engines, heavy ones, moving fast. Tires on wet asphalt. The deep mechanical growl of vehicles that cost more than every car in the apartment complex's parking lot combined. Garrett heard it too. He paused, head tilting slightly, the way an animal turns toward an unfamiliar sound. Then the lobby door downstairs blew open so hard the crash echoed up through the stairwell, and everything that happened next happened fast. Footsteps. Not one pair, many, moving with a rhythm that was disciplined and unhesitating, boots hitting stairs in rapid succession. Celine heard doors opening on the floors below, heard confused voices, heard someone say, "What the hell?" before going silent. Garrett stepped back from the bathroom. He turned toward the apartment's front door. His expression shifted from anger to confusion to something rawer. The dawning comprehension of a man who has suddenly realized he is not the most dangerous thing in the room. "What did you do?" he whispered. The apartment door came off its hinges. It didn't open. It didn't break at the lock. The entire door, frame and all, collapsed inward like something had hit it with a battering ram, and through the cloud of plaster dust and splinters came 4 men who moved with the terrifying efficiency of people who had done this many times before. They wore dark suits, not tactical gear, not body armor, suits, tailored, expensive, cut to allow movement. 3 of them carried suppressed handguns held low against their thighs. The 4th carried nothing but walked in front, and Garrett somehow understood that the unarmed man was the most dangerous one in the group. Garrett tried to fight. She'd give him that much. He was stupid and cruel, but he wasn't a coward. He grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and lunged at the nearest man. It lasted about 4 seconds. The lead operative caught Garrett's wrist, redirected the knife, and put him on the ground with a joint manipulation that made a sound like someone stepping on a walnut. Garrett screamed, a high animal sound that seemed to come from somewhere outside his body. And then a second man was on him, driving a knee into the base of his spine, pinning him to the kitchen floor amid the broken plates and scattered silverware. And then the room went quiet, not silent. The rain was still hammering the windows. Garrett was gasping and moaning on the ground. But there was a quality of stillness that had entered the apartment, a held breath feeling as if the air itself had recognized that something significant was about to happen. Lucien Moretti appeared in the ruined doorway. He was taller than Celine remembered, 6'2" or 6'3", with a build that suggested discipline rather than bulk. The body of a man who trained purposefully and consistently, not for vanity, but because he understood that the capacity for physical violence was as essential to his profession as financial literacy. His hair was dark, pushed back from a face that was striking but not handsome in any conventional way. The features were too sharp, too angular, the cheekbones and jawline cut with a severity that made him look carved rather than born. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and they carried the quality that people who worked for him feared most. Not anger, not cruelty, but a total, absolute stillness. The eyes of a man who had already decided what he was going to do before he walked into any room. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a black suit, both darkened by rain. Water dripped from his hair and ran along his jaw. He didn't wipe it away. He stood in the doorway and surveyed the apartment with a slow, methodical sweep that took in everything: the smashed furniture, the holes in the drywall, the blood on the kitchen floor that might have been Garrett's or might have been Celine's. Then his gaze found the bathroom door. Celine was standing now, barely. She'd pulled herself up using the edge of the bathtub when the door had come down, and she stood in the bathroom doorway gripping the frame with white-knuckled fingers. The fluorescent light behind her turned her into a silhouette, thin, bruised, swaying slightly, her split lip still bleeding. Lucien looked at her. Something passed across his face. It was fast, gone before any of his men could catch it, but Celine saw it clearly because she was watching him the way a drowning person watches a hand reaching into the water. It wasn't pity, it wasn't sympathy. It was something closer to recognition. The same look he'd given her 5 years ago at that party, but deeper now, sharpened by whatever he was seeing in the damage on her face. She looked like Marcus. Standing there in the bad light with blood on her mouth and defiance in her eyes, she looked so much like her dead brother that it hit Lucien somewhere below the ribs, somewhere he'd spent years building walls around. Celine. His voice was even, controlled, but there was a texture to it that hadn't been there on the phone, something careful. Can you walk? She nodded. It was a lie. Her left ankle had twisted when Garrett shoved her into the bathroom 3 hours ago, and it throbbed with every heartbeat. But she nodded because she was Marcus Vale's sister, and Marcus had once walked 6 blocks with a bullet in his shoulder without making a sound. And Celine understood in some animal way that she was being measured right now, not by Lucien's judgment, by her own. Then come with me. She stepped over the threshold of the bathroom, past the kitchen where Garrett lay pinned to the floor. He was bleeding from his nose and his right wrist was bent at a wrong angle. He looked up at Celine as she passed, and for one instant the rage drained from his face and was replaced by something else. Fear, not of the men holding him down, not of the guns, of her, of the fact that she had called someone who could make him disappear, and that she had done it calmly, deliberately, while he was still screaming through the door. "You're dead," he managed, his voice wet and thick. "You know that? You're dead." Celine stopped walking. She looked down at him. The swelling around her left eye made her face asymmetrical, gave her a fractured, shattered mirror quality that was almost beautiful in its wrongness. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just looked at him the way you look at something you've finally decided to step over, and then she kept walking. Lucien's driver had the rear door of a black Escalade open before they reached the parking lot. The rain soaked through Celine's t-shirt in seconds. She was shivering by the time she slid into the back seat, but the shivering wasn't from cold. It was the full-body tremor of a system that had been running on fear for so long that the removal of the threat didn't bring relief. It brought collapse. Lucien climbed in beside her. The door closed. The interior was warm, dark, quiet. A sealed chamber of leather and tinted glass that felt impossibly far from the apartment she'd just left, even though it was 50 feet away. He didn't touch her, didn't try to comfort her, or ask if she was okay, because the answer was obvious, and Lucien Moretti was not a man who wasted words on obvious things. Instead, he opened a compartment between the seats and removed a first aid kit. Not a drugstore kit, a professional trauma kit, the kind medics carried. "Your lip needs closing." "It's fine." "It's not fine. Hold still." He cleaned the split with an antiseptic wipe. His hands were steady and precise, almost clinical, but there was a controlled gentleness in the way he tilted her chin toward the dome light that contradicted everything Celine thought she knew about him. She flinched when the antiseptic hit the open tissue, and his grip firmed. Not harsh, but anchoring, holding her in place the way you'd hold a frightened animal that might bolt. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Ravencrest." The name landed in her chest like a stone. Ravencrest Estate. She'd been there once, 5 years ago. The party. The marble floors. The men in expensive suits speaking in voices too low to hear. "I can't go there." "You can't stay here." "That's not the same thing." Lucien looked at her. In the dim light of the car, his pale eyes were almost luminous, and she could see the calculation behind them. The machine of his mind processing variables, assessing risk, measuring her the way he measured everything. "Your brother worked for me," he said. "He trusted me. I owe a debt for that. Ravencrest is the safest place in this city. My brother is dead." The words hung between them. She watched something tighten in his jaw, a micro-movement, barely visible, but enough to tell her that the subject of Marcus Vale was not one Lucian handled cleanly. "I know," he said. The convoy moved through the rain-swept streets. 3 SUVs, running no lights, taking back roads that wound through industrial neighborhoods and along the waterfront. Celine pressed her forehead against the cool glass and watched the city slide past. Neon signs bleeding color through the rain, empty sidewalks, the dark shapes of buildings she'd known her entire life receding like a coastline. She was leaving and might never find again. Ravencrest Estate sat on a bluff north of the city, surrounded by high walls and monitored by cameras so numerous they turned the approach road into a tunnel of glowing red eyes. The gates opened without the convoy stopping. The driveway wound through manicured grounds that seemed obscene in their beauty. Hedgerows trimmed to geometric precision, stone fountains, imported trees that had no business surviving this climate, but did anyway, because Lucien Moretti could afford to make anything survive. The house itself was enormous. Not a mansion, a compound, stone and glass and iron, built into the cliff face so that the rear of the structure hung over a sheer drop to the ocean. Celine could hear the waves hitting the rocks below, even through the closed car windows, a deep rhythmic percussion that sounded like breathing. Inside, the air smelled like cedar and old money. Celine stood in a foyer with 30-foot ceilings and felt every inch of the distance between this place and the bathroom floor she'd been sitting on an hour ago. The contrast was so extreme it felt surreal, dreamlike, as if she'd fallen through a crack in the world and landed in someone else's life. A woman appeared, mid-50s, dark hair pulled back, wearing a tailored black dress that made her look like something between a housekeeper and a general. Her name was Elena, and she took one look at Celine's face and said nothing, which Celine appreciated more than any words could have conveyed. Elena led her to a guest suite on the second floor. The room was larger than Celine's entire apartment. Clean sheets, heavy curtains, a bathroom with a stone floor, and a shower that had more settings than her car's dashboard. "There are clothes in the closet," Elena said. "Anything you need, use the intercom. Mr. Moretti has asked that you rest. He'll speak with you in the morning." She left. The door closed with a soft click. Celine stood in the middle of the room and breathed. Just breathed. In, out, the way you do when you've been underwater and you've finally broken the surface, and the air itself feels like something you have to relearn how to use. She didn't sleep. She showered, stood underwater hot enough to redden her skin and watched diluted blood run off her chin and swirl around the drain. She put on clothes that didn't belong to her and sat on the edge of a bed that was softer than anything she'd ever felt and stared at the wall and waited for the feeling of safety to arrive. It didn't come, because she knew something that Lucien Moretti hadn't said, something that hovered in the margins of everything that had happened tonight. She knew that in the world Lucien inhabited, every action created a reaction. Every gesture had a cost. He'd sent an armed team into the Narrows in the middle of the night, in vehicles that screamed organized crime, to extract a nobody. A girl with no connections, no leverage, no value except for the dead brother whose face she carried. Word would travel. It always did. In a city like Blackwater, information was currency, and someone would spend it. The Mafia king rescued a girl at midnight. That made her visible, and in Lucien's world, visible meant vulnerable. Celine sat on the bed in her borrowed clothes, staring at the door of a room that was beautiful and fortified and absolutely, terrifyingly not hers, and she understood with the cold clarity of a person who'd been surviving since she was 17 that she hadn't escaped anything tonight. She'd just changed cages. Downstairs, in a study lined with dark wood and old books, Lucien Moretti sat behind a desk and stared at his phone. On the screen was a photograph he hadn't looked at in years. Marcus Vale, 23 years old, standing on the docks with the harbor behind him, grinning, alive. Lucien closed the photo. He picked up a different phone, encrypted, routed through 3 proxy servers, and dialed. The voice that answered was sharp, familiar, and carried the easy confidence of a man who believed he was trusted. "Late night," Roman Viscari said. "What's happening?" "I need a security detail at Ravencrest. Full rotation, starting now." A pause, the sound of Roman shifting in a chair, fabric against leather. "For what?" "Marcus Vale's sister. She's here." The silence on Roman's end lasted exactly 2 seconds too long. Anyone else wouldn't have noticed. But Lucien had built his empire on noticing the things that lasted 2 seconds too long. The pauses, the glances, the micro-hesitations that separated truth from performance. "I didn't know Marcus had a sister," Roman said smoothly. Lucien's jaw tightened, because Roman did know. He'd known for years, and the fact that he chose to lie about it, casually, reflexively, without even the effort of making it convincing, dropped a small cold stone into the well of Lucien's instincts. "Full rotation," Lucien repeated. "I want the perimeter doubled. Eyes on every approach road." "Done. Anything else?" "Not tonight." He hung up, sat in the dark study with the rain hammering the windows and the ocean crashing against the cliffs below. And for the first time in years, Lucien Moretti felt something he couldn't control. Not anger, not guilt, doubt. The stone in his gut told him something was wrong. Something connected to Marcus's death 5 years ago that he'd buried because the grief was too close and the questions too dangerous. Something that slept in the architecture of his organization like a crack in a foundation, invisible until pressure found it. He pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a sealed envelope. Inside it was a single flash drive, unlabeled, given to him by Marcus Vale 3 days before Marcus died. Marcus had pressed it into Lucien's hand at the docks, his jaw set hard, his eyes carrying something Lucien had never seen in them before. Fear. "If something happens to me," Marcus had said, "look at what's on this." Nothing had happened for 4 days. Then Marcus was dead. Shot twice in a warehouse on the east side during what was reported as a deal gone wrong. Lucien had ordered an investigation. The investigation found nothing. The case went cold. The flash drive went into the drawer. Lucien had never opened it. He held it in his palm now, turning it over under the desk lamp. The USB connector glinted. Whatever was on this drive had been important enough for Marcus to risk everything by handing it to the boss directly, bypassing every lieutenant, every captain, every layer of the chain of command, including Roman. Lucien set the drive on the desk. Above him, on the second floor, Celine sat awake in her room, staring at the ceiling while the ocean thundered beneath the house. In a penthouse across the city, Roman Viscari stood at a window, watching the rain, holding a phone that still showed the duration of Lucien's call. 3 people, 3 rooms, 3 versions of the same silence, and somewhere in that silence, the machinery of something terrible was already beginning to turn. The flash drive sat on the corner of Lucien's desk until 4 in the morning. He didn't touch it. He sat in the leather chair with a glass of bourbon he hadn't drunk and stared at the thing the way you stare at a door you're not sure you want to open, knowing that whatever is on the other side has been waiting regardless of whether you look, knowing that ignorance and safety stopped being the same thing the moment Marcus Vale's sister appeared on his phone at midnight with blood in her voice. The study was dark except for the desk lamp. Rain continued its assault on the windows. The ocean below the cliff was in full violence, waves detonating against the rock with impacts that traveled up through the foundation and into the soles of Lucien's feet where they rested flat on the floor. He'd been sitting like that for 2 hours. Not thinking exactly, processing, running variables in the cold, methodical part of his brain that never fully slept, even when the rest of him was exhausted. Marcus had given him the drive 3 days before dying in a warehouse that Lucien owned. That detail had always bothered him. The warehouse was on the East Docks, one of 8 that cycled through legitimate and less legitimate cargo depending on the season and the contract. Marcus had been found there at 2 in the morning with 2 bullets in his chest, and the official story was a deal gone wrong. An independent buyer who'd gotten nervous, reached for a weapon, and fled before anyone could identify him. The investigation had lasted 3 weeks, and found nothing except a missing shell casing and a security camera that had malfunctioned 6 hours before the shooting. Lucien had accepted it because the alternative required him to believe something he wasn't ready to believe. He picked up the flash drive, turned it over. plugged it into the laptop he kept in the bottom drawer. Air-gapped, never networked, used specifically for things he didn't want attached to any server or cloud or system that could be accessed by anyone else. The drive opened. One folder. Inside the folder, 7 files. 3 were encrypted ledgers, compressed spreadsheets that would take time to parse. 2 were audio recordings. 1 was a document titled simply R. Lucian opened the document first. It was 6 pages long. Marcus had written it in the months before he died in a style that was functional rather than polished. The writing of a careful man who understood that clarity mattered more than elegance when the subject matter could get people killed. No flourishes, no hedging, just dates, names, transaction records, and observations compiled with the systematic patience of someone who'd been watching and waiting for a long time before deciding to write any of it down. By page 2, Lucian's breathing had changed. By page 4, his jaw was set so hard his back teeth ached. By page 6, he closed the laptop, sat back in the chair, and spent 3 full minutes doing something he hadn't done since he was 22 years old. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Just the process of absorbing a truth so corrosive it needed time before you could touch it with your hands. Roman Viscari had been moving money through the Moretti syndicate for 18 months. Not Moretti money, outside money. Riviera cartel funds, laundered through shell companies that Marcus had traced back to Roman's personal accounts through a chain of transactions so deliberately convoluted that it had taken Marcus 4 months of careful, dangerous, off-the-books investigation to map it. The Riviera cartel were the Moretti syndicate's primary competition for the port. They'd been trying to break into Blackwater's docks for a decade. And Roman, who had been at Lucian's right hand for 8 years, Roman, who had stood at Lucian's father's funeral and put his fist against his chest and sworn loyalty to the Moretti name. Roman had been taking their money and feeding them access. The warehouse on the East Dock where Marcus died. That warehouse had been cleared for a Riviera operation 3 days before the shooting, cleared by an authorization code that traced back to Roman's office. Marcus had found out. Marcus had written it down, and Marcus had brought it to Lucian. Too late. Lucian sat in the dark with the weight of it pressing down on him like something physical. 8 years. He'd known Roman for 8 years. Trusted him with logistics, with security, with the names of people Lucian protected and the details of operations Lucian couldn't afford to have exposed. He'd taken Roman into the architecture of everything he'd built, and Roman had stood inside it like a load-bearing wall, while quietly, systematically hollowing out the foundation. And Marcus Vale had died because he'd found out. Had been murdered. In Lucian's warehouse. By an order that came through Lucian's own chain of command. The bourbon was still in the glass. Lucian drank half of it in one long pull and felt it burn down the center of his chest. He needed to move carefully. If Roman had killed Marcus to protect this, he'd do it again. He'd do it to anyone who threatened the same exposure. He had allies inside the organization, men whose loyalty Lucian had assumed but never tested, men Roman had been cultivating for years with the quiet patience of a man running a very long game. Lucian couldn't move against Roman tonight. Not with the evidence alone. He needed it confirmed, corroborated, locked down in a way that couldn't be denied or dismantled. And he couldn't let Roman know the drive existed, which meant the next conversation he had with Roman Viscari needed to be completely normal. He was still sitting with that thought when he heard footsteps in the hallway above him. Celine had given up on sleep somewhere around 3. She'd lain on the bed for 2 hours in the dark, every nerve in her body still running on the stripped wire current of the night's events, and eventually she accepted that her body wasn't going to cooperate. She changed into a pair of black sweatpants and a gray long-sleeve shirt she found in the closet and went looking for the kitchen. Ravencrest's hallways at 4 in the morning were a specific kind of unsettling. Wide corridors, old stone walls, expensive art in frames that probably cost more than her annual rent, and the constant deep percussion of the ocean below. She passed 3 doors, 2 of which were locked. She found the main staircase, started down it. Lucien was standing at the bottom. He'd heard her coming. Of course he had. He was a man who'd survived 20 years in organized crime by noticing things before they arrived. And she'd been walking on old hardwood and socked feet, which made a certain amount of sound regardless of her effort. He looked up at her from the base of the stairs. He'd removed the suit jacket and rolled his shirt sleeves to the elbow. His tie was gone. His hair had dried, but it hadn't been fixed, and without the polished presentation he'd worn when he arrived at the apartment, he looked younger and, paradoxically, more dangerous. As if the formality had been a kind of armor, and without it there was nothing between you and whatever was actually underneath. He was holding a glass. He looked at her face, the swelling, the closed-up eye, the butterfly closure on her lip, with an expression that contained nothing he was willing to share. "You should be sleeping," he said. "I tried. Kitchen is that way." He tilted his head toward the east corridor. She came the rest of the way down the stairs and followed the direction he'd indicated. She found the kitchen, industrial grade, stainless everything, large enough to serve a 100-person event, and stood in front of an open refrigerator for 30 seconds without actually registering its contents. She heard him come in behind her, heard the scrape of a stool against the stone floor. "There's food," he said. "Elena stocks it even when no one's here." "I'm not hungry." "Then why are you looking in the refrigerator?" She closed it, turned around, leaned against the counter and looked at him sitting on the stool with his bourbon and his rolled-up sleeves, and the particular stillness of a man who'd been up all night processing something that had taken a piece out of him. She noticed because she recognized it. She'd seen it in Marcus. The Marcus who came home after bad nights at the docks and sat at their kitchen table and stared at the wall with an expression that was carefully neutral and completely haunted. "What happened tonight?" she said. What does it actually mean? For you." Lucien looked at her. "It means the city is going to know I moved assets to the Narrows, which means everyone who wanted to get to you through Marcus is going to know you exist. I didn't exist before tonight? You were invisible. No connections, no value, no reason for anyone to track you. Now? Now you're the woman Lucien Moretti sent a team for." The silence in the kitchen was different from the silence in the study or the guest room. It was the silence of two people who were being honest with each other in a way that carried risk. "You didn't have to do that," Celine said. "No." "Why did you?" He didn't answer for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to. He turned the bourbon glass in his hand, watching the liquid tilt and settle. "Your brother saved my life," Lucien said, 3 years before he died. "There was an attempt on me at the South Harbor. Marcus pulled me out of the vehicle before the second shot and put his body between me and the shooter for long enough that my security could neutralize the threat." He set the glass down. "I never repaid that." Celine felt the words land somewhere deep and cold in her chest. "He never told me that." "He wouldn't have." "What does it have to do with Garrett?" "Nothing, everything." Lucien looked up. "It has to do with the fact that your brother died working for me, and the least I owe the name Vale is a phone call answered and a team deployed. That's all it is." She looked at him for a long time, trying to find the lie in it, because she'd learned how to look for lies. Garrett had been an excellent teacher in that particular education. But she didn't find one. What she found was something harder and less comfortable than a lie. A man genuinely trying to pay a debt he'd decided he owed, with no interest in being thanked for it. "The people who want to get to me," she said. "Are they coming here?" "Probably." "How soon?" "Soon enough that we won't be having many more conversations like this one." She nodded. She picked up a glass from the cabinet, filled it from the tap, drank half of it standing at the sink. "Then I want to know about my brother," she said. Lucien went still. "Not tonight. You just told me people are coming. You just told me I'm visible now. I want to know why Marcus died." Her voice was level and direct and carried a steel underneath that surprised even her. "I want to know what happened in that warehouse." "Celine, he was 26 years old." The steel sharpened to an edge. "He was 26 years old, and someone shot him twice in the chest in a building you owned. And the investigation found nothing, and I never got an explanation from anyone." She set the glass down on the counter with a deliberate click. "So tell me." Lucien looked at her. Something was working behind his eyes, a calculation that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the specific gravity of what she was asking and what answering would cost both of them. "I'll tell you what I know," he said finally, "which is less than it should be, and I'll tell you the rest when I have confirmation." "Confirmation of what?" "That the person I think is responsible is actually responsible." She stared at him. "You know who killed Marcus?" "I have a strong suspicion. I have documentation that supports it. I need 24 hours to verify before I do anything about it." The kitchen was very quiet. The ocean hummed below the house. "Who?" she asked. "Not yet." Lucien, not yet. His voice was quiet, but it hit a register that stopped the conversation the way a wall stops forward motion. Not cruel, authoritative. The voice of someone who had learned that the timing of information was as important as the information itself, and who understood that telling Celine Vale the name Roman Vescari while she was in this house, surrounded by Roman's people, before Lucien could secure his position, would be the fastest way to get her killed. She saw it, didn't like it. But she was Marcus Vale's sister, which meant she was capable of recognizing the difference between a man withholding the truth out of malice and one withholding it out of strategy. Fine, she said, but when you have your confirmation, you tell me first, before you do anything. That's not how I operate. I'm not one of your men. No. He stood up, which is exactly why I'm trying to keep you alive long enough to have this conversation properly. He picked up the bourbon glass and carried it to the sink, rinsed it, set it on the drying rack with the precision of a man who did things completely or not at all. Go back to bed. Or don't. But stay in the house. He left the kitchen. Celine stood at the counter and listened to his footsteps diminish down the corridor and felt something she couldn't immediately name, a complicated emotion that lived in the overlap between grief and anger and something that wasn't gratitude but was adjacent to it. Something that felt like being seen, which was not the same as being safe, but at 4 a.m, with blood dried on your lip and the ruins of your previous life 40 minutes behind you, being seen felt like its own kind of oxygen. Roman Vescari arrived at Ravencrest at 10 the next morning, unannounced. Celine was in the East Garden when the SU5 came through the gate. She'd found the garden by accident, a courtyard on the building's east face, open to the sky, where the stone walls blocked the wind off the ocean, and the morning sun fell warm and direct on iron benches and beds of winter greenery that had no business growing this far north. She'd been sitting on one of the benches with a coffee Elena had brought her, watching a pair of birds argue in the branches of a bare oak, when she heard the vehicle on the gravel drive. She watched through the iron gate that separated the garden from the main forecourt as the SUV stopped and a man climbed out. 40, maybe 42. Medium height, well-built without being conspicuously so, with the kind of looks that worked in any room. The slightly too perfect jaw, the easy posture, the smile that appeared preemptively, before there was anything to smile about. He wore a dark gray suit and no tie, collar open, the intentional casualness of a man performing relaxation. His eyes were dark and quick, and they swept the forecourt in a single pass that cataloged everything present before his expression had fully settled on whatever it was showing the world. He went inside. A few minutes later, Celine heard voices through an open window on the ground floor. She moved closer to the building, keeping to the shadow of the garden wall. Here you had an eventful night. Roman's voice. Easy, warm, the voice of a man comfortable in rooms where power was exercised. Business, Lucian's voice from further inside the room, flat. The girl, Marcus Vale's sister. A pause. You didn't mention you knew him personally. The connection. I didn't think it was relevant. It's relevant when you deploy a full tactical team to the Narrows at midnight. The Bianchi people saw the convoy. They're asking questions. Tell them it was a property matter. A short laugh from Roman. Lucien, come on, they're not going to buy. Tell them what I said. The tone shut Roman's laugh down cleanly. A brief silence. What's the plan with her? She stays here until I determine the threat level. What threat? She's a nobody. Garrett Hale is a drunk who's going to wake up with a broken wrist and not say a word to anyone because he knows what happens if he does. Roman's voice stayed smooth, almost bored. I don't understand the exposure you're accepting for this. I don't need you to understand it. I'm your second. A slight edge now, just barely audible, quickly covered. When you take on a liability, it's my job to understand the risk profile. That's what you pay me for. Then consider this part of your risk assessment. Marcus Vale was valuable to this organization, and his family is now under my protection. If anyone has a problem with that, they can bring it to me directly. A long pause. Celine had her back pressed against the stone wall beside the window, breathing shallow. Understood, Roman said finally. The warmth was still there in his voice, but it had taken on a hollow quality, the way wood sounds when there's nothing behind it. She heard them move toward the interior of the house. Their voices faded. Celine stood in the garden for a long time after, turning what she'd heard over in her mind. She couldn't have said exactly what bothered her about Roman Viscari. Nothing overt. Nothing she could point at and name. It was an accumulation of small things, the preemptive smile, the way his voice had tilted almost imperceptibly when he said Marcus Vale's name, a micro-hesitation that could mean anything or nothing. The fact that he'd come here in person, unannounced, the morning after a late-night phone call, to ask about her specifically. People who asked questions they already knew the answers to. She'd learned to spot those too. Roman found her at noon. She'd come inside by then, settled in a small sitting room off the east corridor with a book she wasn't reading. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Unhurried, deliberate. The walk of a man going somewhere he'd decided to go rather than somewhere he'd been directed. He appeared in the doorway. The smile was already there. It was a very good smile. Warm eyes, slight crinkling at the corners, the whole arrangement designed to project trustworthiness with the efficiency of a well-engineered machine. "You must be Celine," he said. "I'm Roman. I run operations here." She looked up from the book. "I know who you are." Something moved in his eyes, gone before she could catch it. "Lucian mentioned me?" "He mentioned you last night. Good things, I hope." The smile held. He leaned against the doorframe with the comfortable ease of a man marking territory through body language alone. "I wanted to come introduce myself. This is an unusual situation, and I imagine it's disorienting. I just want you to know that everyone here is here to make sure you're safe." "That's kind of you," Celine said. Marcus was well liked here. His loss was, he paused, tilted his head, felt by everyone. "Were you close to him?" "We worked together. He was good at his job. Reliable." A beat. "Do you have anything of his? A keepsake, something he left with you? Sometimes when people lose someone, suddenly they find comfort in..." "No." She said it before she thought about why she was saying it. The instinct arrived before the logic, a flat, immediate denial that came from the same animal place that had kept her alive through 3 years with Garrett Hale. "He didn't leave me anything." Roman's eyes stayed on her face for exactly 1 second too long. "Of course," he said. "Well, if you need anything, I'm on the 2nd floor, East Wing." The smile, the warmth, the door pulling closed behind him. Celine sat very still in the chair. She thought about Marcus's storage unit, the one she'd been paying $14 a month to maintain since he died, out of a combination of poverty and inability to face whatever was inside it. She'd never opened it, couldn't make herself. It was a 2x3 metal box in a storage facility on the south side, and it contained whatever Marcus had considered important enough to store outside of his apartment. She'd had the key on her keychain for 5 years, worn smooth from being carried but never used. She reached into the pocket of her borrowed jeans and found it there. Small, brass, scratched. She pressed her thumb against the teeth of the key and thought about Roman Viscari's eyes when he'd asked her if Marcus left her anything. Not grief in those eyes. Purpose. That evening, Lucien confirmed it. He came to the sitting room after dinner, closed the door, and sat across from her in the chair by the window. The sun had dropped behind the cliff, and the room was in the blue-gray light of early dusk. He looked like he'd aged 3 years since the previous night. Whatever he'd spent the day doing, it had cost him. "I have the confirmation," he said. Celine set down the coffee cup she'd been holding. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by that. "Roman." He stared at her. "How long have you known?" "I suspected this afternoon." The way he asked about Marcus's belongings. Lucian's jaw worked. He put his forearms on his knees and leaned forward and stared at the floor with the expression of a man carrying something that had no good place to be set down. "Roman ordered the hit on your brother," he said. "Marcus had documentation of Roman's relationship with the Riviera cartel. He found out Marcus brought it to me. He moved before I could look at it." He paused. "Your brother died because he trusted me with information that my own second-in-command needed buried." Celine heard it, let it move through her, felt the grief reform into something harder and more directed. "He didn't just kill Marcus," she said slowly. "He wanted the documentation." "Yes." "Which means he thinks it's still out there. Which means he thinks you have it." The silence in the room was the specific silence of two people understanding simultaneously that they are standing on ground that has been compromised beneath them. "He came to me today," Celine said. "He asked if Marcus left me anything." "I know. The rooms are monitored." A pause. "I should have told you that." "Yes," she said flatly. "You should have." Lucienne looked up, held her gaze. There was nothing apologetic in his expression. Apology wasn't a language he spoke fluently, but there was something else. Acknowledgement. The specific recognition that he owed her more than he'd been giving her. "There's a storage unit," Celine said. "Marcus rented it. I've had the key for 5 years." "What's in it?" "I don't know. I never opened it." They looked at each other. The weight of what was in that storage unit took him, the documentation Roman had killed for, the evidence that could dismantle everything Roman had spent years constructing, was suddenly present in the room between them like a third person. "If I go get it," Celine said, "you can finish what Marcus started. If you go near that storage unit, Roman will know. He's had surveillance on it since Marcus died. He just hasn't found a way to get inside it without drawing attention." Lucien's voice was careful, controlled, but underneath it she could hear the machinery working. "The moment you move toward it, he'll know the documentation exists and that you know where it is." "Then we go tonight," Celine said, before he expects it." "It's not that simple. My brother is dead." Her voice was quiet and absolute. "I've been living in a bathroom in the Narrows for 3 years, and I had no idea it was because someone was trying to keep me contained and isolated. I had no idea Garrett Hale was being paid to break me." The sentence arrived before she'd consciously assembled it, and the truth of it hit her like a physical blow. The understanding that Garrett's presence in her life had not been coincidence, but construction. That she had been deliberately diminished and isolated and frightened for years by design. "That man built a cage around me." Lucienne said nothing. He was watching her face with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Tell me that's not what Roman was doing," she said. Lucien's jaw tightened. "I can't tell you that." The last light faded from the window. The ocean moved beneath the house. Somewhere in the East Wing, Roman Viscari was on a phone, and the conversation he was having was almost certainly about Celine Vale and what she might be carrying. "We go tonight," Celine said again, and this time Lucienne didn't say it wasn't that simple. He stood up, went to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. 3 hours, he said. "Get some rest." He left. Celine sat in the blue dark of the sitting room with Marcus's key pressed between both palms, and felt the full weight of what was coming settle onto her like armor, cold, heavy, necessary. In the East Wing, Roman ended one call and began another. "She knows something," he said. "Move the team to the South Storage District, tonight." A pause. "And deal with the boyfriend. He's a loose end." The line went silent. The house breathed around her, full of people whose loyalty she could not verify. In a city that had been hunting her for years without her knowledge, and the only thing standing between her and the machinery that had destroyed her brother was a man she barely knew who was 90 seconds away from deciding whether she was worth the war that was coming. She was already in it. That was the thing no one had told her, and she'd figured out too late. She'd been in it since the night Marcus Vale died. Since the moment Roman Viscari looked at a 22-year-old girl living in the Narrows and decided she was safer broken than functional, safer small than capable, safer invisible than alive. She pressed the key hard enough against her palm to leave a mark. The mark of a key that had waited 5 years to be used. Tonight, she was going to use it. They left Ravencrest at 2 in the morning. No convoy this time. One vehicle, a dark gray sedan registered to a shell company that existed on paper only, chosen specifically because it looked like the kind of car that accountants and night shift nurses drove. Invisible in the way that ordinary things are invisible. Lucien drove himself. Celine sat in the passenger seat with Marcus's key in her fist and her good eye watching the side mirror. Her left eye had opened to a narrow slit since the previous night, enough to see through, enough to register the city coming at them through the rain-slicked windshield in broken neon fragments. Lucien had told Roman he was meeting with the Bianchi representatives at the Harbor Club. He'd constructed the cover with the flat efficiency of someone who'd been lying to dangerous people for long enough that the construction of a convincing deception required no more effort than tying a shoe. Elena knew where they were going. 2 men, not Roman's people, Men Lucien had pulled from a separate unit that Roman had no visibility into were already parked 2 blocks from the storage facility on Crane Street, waiting. The city at 2 in the morning was a different organism than the city that existed during daylight. The streets had a bleached, stripped-down quality, the neon and chrome that made Blackwater look vital and vicious during business hours reduced to isolated pools of color separated by long stretches of dark. A delivery truck moved through an intersection ahead of them, slow and purposeful. A woman in a yellow coat stood outside a diner smoking. 3 men on the corner of Halcyon and South said nothing as the sedan passed, just watched with the patient attention of people who conducted their business in the hours when the city wasn't watching. Celine had not slept. She'd lain on the bed for 90 minutes in the blue dark and stared at the ceiling and done nothing except listen to the house breathe around her. At 1:50, she'd gotten dressed. The black jeans, a dark sweater from the closet, boots she'd been wearing when she arrived, and sat on the edge of the bed until she heard the quiet double knock at the door that meant it was time. Now she sat in the passenger seat and tried to think clearly. The clarity kept slipping, not from fear. She'd made a functional peace with fear over the last 24 hours, reached some kind of working agreement with the adrenaline that said, "I see you. I know you're here. Now stay to the left and don't get in the way." What kept slipping was something else. The image of Roman Viscari's face when he'd asked her if Marcus left her anything. The way his eyes had moved. Unhurried, precise. The sweep of a man reading a room rather than experiencing it. And underneath that, Garrett. Garrett with his broken furniture and his low, calm voice saying, "You made me do this." Garrett, who had been paid, who had been placed in her life or maintained in her life, or fed information about her life by a man who wanted her isolated and reduced and too damaged to think clearly enough to be a threat. 3 years. She'd lost 3 years to a cage someone else had built around her. The anger about that was different from other anger she'd carried. It wasn't hot and volatile. It was cold and structural, the kind of anger that doesn't consume itself in immediate reaction, but instead integrates into the load-bearing architecture of who you're becoming. "The 2 men at the facility," she said, "you trust them?" "Yes." "Roman's never used them?" "They've never been assigned to his unit. They came up through a separate track. Port security, not operations." "That doesn't mean he doesn't know them." Lucien glanced at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, but its neighboring territory. "No," he said. "It doesn't." "How long has Roman been running the Riviera money?" "According to what Marcus documented, 18 months. Then he's had 18 months to identify everyone in your organization who isn't already his." She looked at the side mirror again. The street behind them was clear. "He's thorough. You said it yourself. He's been doing this for years. He found Marcus. He found Garrett. He surveilled a storage unit for 5 years." "I know what he is." "Then you know that the people you're trusting tonight might not be trustworthy." The sedan moved through a long dark block, past a shuttered warehouse, and a chain-link fence with weeds pushing through its lower sections. Lucian's hands were steady on the wheel. His face in the glow of the instrument panel was composed, arranged, the neutral mask of a man who had faced uncertainty for long enough that it no longer produced visible response. But she was watching him the way Marcus had taught her to watch people. Not the face, the jaw. The jaw was where it lived. The micro-tensions that the face learned to control, but the jaw never quite did. Lucien's jaw was tight. He was worried about the same thing she was. "We get in and get out," he said. 15 minutes maximum. "And then?" "Then we go somewhere Roman doesn't know about, and we spend the night pulling apart whatever Marcus left in that unit. And then you move against him." "Then I move against him." She nodded, turned back to the windshield. The storage facility on Crane Street was 2 blocks ahead now, a low-lying complex of corrugated metal units behind a security fence, lit by sodium vapor lights that turned everything orange and flat. The sign above the gate read "South Side Secure Storage" in letters that had been losing a battle against weather for about a decade. Lucien cut the headlights a block out and rolled to a stop at the curb. He picked up his phone and sent a single-word text. 30 seconds later, his phone vibrated once. "Clear," he said. "They got out." The rain had stopped, but the air was wet and cold. The kind of cold that goes through jacket fabric like it's not there. Celine pulled the collar of her sweater up, and followed Lucien along the fence line to where a gate stood held open by one of his two men, a compact, light-skinned man named Darrow, who moved with the economy of someone who'd spent time somewhere that required it. He acknowledged Lucien with a nod and Selene with nothing, which was the correct response. The second man was positioned at the far end of the facility with a sight line to the access road. Lucien had drawn Selene a rough map of the layout during the drive, and she'd memorized it. 24 rows, 6 units deep, lettered and numbered. Marcus's unit was B14. Second row, near the middle. The facility was quiet, except for the distant sound of a freight train moving through the rail yard 2 blocks east, its low horn a mournful punctuation to the silence. Their boots on the concrete path between the rows were the loudest thing in the world. B14 was identical to every other unit in the facility, a 6-foot corrugated roll-up door with a padlock hasp. The padlock was heavy, the kind designed to resist bolt cutters, and it had been there for 5 years without anyone opening it. Selene crouched in front of it. The key went in on the second try. Her hands were steadier than she expected. The lock opened with a click that sounded enormous in the orange silence. She pulled the roll-up door. It went up with a metallic rattle that seemed to echo across the entire facility. The unit was 8 feet deep. In it, 3 cardboard boxes sealed with packing tape, a duffel bag, a bicycle with a flat rear tire leaning against the left wall, and a folding table with a laptop on it protected by a clear plastic case. Selene stood in the entrance and looked at the space where her brother's hidden life had been waiting. Lucien stepped in beside her. He went straight to the laptop case, checked the seal, tucked it under his arm. He opened the duffel bag. Clothes, a burner phone still in its packaging, a roll of cash, a spare magazine for a handgun that wasn't there. Selene went to the boxes. The first one was books, technical manuals, shipping industry publications, nothing remarkable. The second held personal items, photographs, a watch, a folded flag that had belonged to their father, a small notebook with a broken spine. She picked up the notebook. Her hands weren't steady anymore. Marcus's handwriting filled the first 20 pages. Dates, initials, transaction figures. The same systematic precision she'd seen in the document Lucien had described from the flash drive, but this version was handwritten, the pen impressions deep enough in some places that she could feel the urgency of the writing through the paper. He'd been pressing hard, pressing the way you do when you're afraid of running out of time. She turned to the last written page. The entry was dated 3 days before he died. Brought the drive to L. Don't know if he'll look at it. R is at the docks tonight. Don't know if he saw me go in. Going to lie low for 48 hours and then reach back out. If something happens before then, S. If you're reading this, it's storage unit B14, Crane Street. Code is the year Dad came home. The rest is inside the laptop. Don't trust anyone in the organization except L directly. Not even the people who say they're L's. Only L. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I was trying to protect you. Don't let them make you small. Selene read it twice. The words blurred. She blinked them clear. She was not going to cry in this storage unit at 2 a.m. with Lucien Moretti 3 feet away. She was not going to do that. She closed the notebook and put it in the interior pocket of her jacket, against her ribs. He knew, she said. Her voice came out even. He knew something might happen. Lucien had gone still behind her. She turned and saw him looking at his phone. His expression had changed. The composed mask had developed a crack, something coming through it that she didn't have a name for yet. We need to go, he said. Now. What? Now, Selene. She grabbed the notebook, the laptop case from Lucien's hands out of reflex, the duffel's outer pocket, and then Lucien's hand was on her arm, not rough, but definitive, moving her toward the exit with a velocity that told her the calculation in his head had shifted drastically in the last 30 seconds. They came out of the unit fast. Lucien pulled the door down behind them. Not locked. No time. And they moved back up the row toward the gate where Darrow was standing. Except Darrow wasn't standing where they'd left him. The gate was open. The sedan was visible at the curb where they'd left it. But the space where Darrow had been positioned was empty, and in the orange light of the sodium vapor lamps, Selene could see the gate's chain lying on the ground, and she could see that it hadn't been opened. It had been cut. Lucien stopped walking. His hand came out and caught her arm, pressing her back against the side of a storage unit. He was already drawing the handgun from the holster under his jacket, moving without sound, his body dropping into a low, controlled posture. Celine pressed her back to the corrugated metal wall and listened. She heard it then. Not a sound exactly, an absence. The freight train had stopped. The night had gotten too quiet, the way nights do when there are people in them who are trying very hard not to make noise. Then from the far end of the facility, where Lucian's second man had been positioned, 3 sounds came in fast succession. The muffled compression of a suppressed shot, a body hitting concrete. Silence. Lucian turned to look at her. In the orange half-dark, his pale eyes were absolutely clear, all calculation, no emotion. The eyes of a man who has reached the moment on the other side of all his preparation and found that it has arrived earlier and from a worse angle than planned. "Run left," he said quietly, "along the back fence. There's a gap at the southeast corner, maintenance access. Get through it, get to the rail yard, stay low, and keep moving east. Don't stop." "What about you?" "I'll be 40 seconds behind you. Go." She went. She cleared the end of the row and turned left at a full run along the back of the facility, her boots hitting concrete hard, the laptop case tucked under one arm, the notebook pressing against her ribs. She was counting the rows as she passed them. B, C, D, E, trying to hold the mental map steady while her lungs worked and the sweat came up cold across her forehead. Behind her she heard voices, more than 2. And then she heard Lucien's voice, not running, standing, and the sound it was projecting, level, commanding, absolutely controlled, told her he was doing something deliberate, drawing attention, buying her the 40 seconds he'd promised. She found the gap in the southeast corner. Not a gap, a section of chain link that had been pushed inward at the base, a maintenance shortcut that had probably been used by facility workers for years. She went through it on her hands and knees, the cold, wet ground soaking into her jeans, and came out the other side into a strip of waste ground that separated the facility from the rail yard's outer fence. She got to her feet, kept moving. The rail yard was a dark geometry of tracks and container cars and signal towers, lit at wide intervals by harsh white safety lights that created pools of visibility surrounded by deep shadow. She moved between the shadows, staying low, counting her breaths, listening for pursuit. She heard running. Someone was behind her. She cut between 2 container cars, dropped to a crouch behind a wheel housing the size of a small car, and held her breath. The running stopped. A figure came through the gap in the fence, moved into the rail yard at a jog, flashlight cutting the dark. Not Lucian. Lucian moved differently, purposeful and conserved. This person was moving like someone following a trail. Celine didn't wait to see if there were more. She moved deeper into the yard, using the container cars as cover, working her way east the way Lucian had told her. Every step was deliberate now, heel to toe, staying off the gravel and onto the steel rail ties where her boots made less sound. Somewhere back at the facility, she heard glass breaking, then silence, then 2 more muffled shots. She stopped walking, stood very still between 2 container cars with her hand pressed flat against painted steel and her whole body vibrating with the effort of holding still. Lucienne. She had no way of knowing if those shots were Lucienne firing or Lucienne being fired at, and the not knowing was its own kind of violence. She moved. She had to move. Standing still in a rail yard in the middle of the night, waiting to find out if the only person who knew where she was had just been killed, was not a viable strategy. She moved east, faster now, no longer concerned with sound, putting distance between herself and whoever was behind her. She came out of the rail yard through a pedestrian gate that opened onto a side street she didn't recognize. Industrial, empty, a row of loading dock doors and a single streetlight at the far end. She stopped at the edge of the street and looked both ways. Nothing moving. Her phone. She'd left it at Ravencrest on Elena's instructions. A security protocol, no personal devices. Lucian had been clear about that. She had nothing. No phone, no car, no money. She had a notebook against her ribs, a laptop case under her arm, and a key that was no longer useful for anything. And she had Lucian's instruction. East. Keep moving east. She kept moving. 20 minutes later, a car she didn't recognize slowed beside her on a street called Dockside Approach, and the window came down, and Lucian said, "Get in." She got in. He was bleeding. Not badly. A cut along his left temple, already clotting, that had run enough blood to stain his collar dark. He was also breathing hard in a way he wasn't trying to conceal, which told her the last 20 minutes had been physical in ways she hadn't witnessed. His gun was holstered. His hands on the wheel were steady. She didn't ask if he was all right. He wasn't all right, and they both knew it, and asking would have been a waste of the air in the car. "Darrow?" she said. "I don't know." "The other one?" "Dead." She absorbed that. A man was dead. A man Lucien had trusted enough to bring on a covert operation at 2 a.m, and he was on a concrete floor in a rail yard because she had a notebook with her brother's handwriting in it. "How did they know?" she asked. Lucien's jaw was very tight. "Someone made a call." "From Ravencrest?" "Yes. Before we left." The window between when I told Elena and when we pulled out of the gate was 11 minutes. His voice was flat and controlled and absolutely furious in its flatness. "Elena has worked for me for 9 years. That doesn't mean Roman doesn't have something on her." "I know that." A pause. "I know that." She turned and looked at him directly. In the low light of the car, with the blood on his face and the controlled fury in his jaw and the specific quality of exhaustion that comes from finding out you've been outmaneuvered by someone you trusted, he looked like a man standing on the edge of something he couldn't cross back from. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere Roman doesn't know about." "Does that place exist?" A long silence. Outside the car, Blackwater's pre-dawn streets slid past in gray and orange, empty and watchful. "There's a property," Lucien said carefully, "off the north grid. It's registered under a holding company that was set up before Roman joined the organization. He's never had access to those files." "You're sure?" "I'm as sure as I can be about anything tonight, which is less sure than I'd like." They drove in silence for a long time. Celine opened the laptop case and checked the seal on the protective casing, intact. The notebook was still against her ribs. Marcus had spent months building this evidence, had died for it, had written her name in the last entry and said, "Don't let them make you small." She pressed her fingertips against the notebook's spine through the fabric of her jacket and felt the impression of the pen strokes underneath, the urgency Marcus had pressed into the paper. She thought about what Roman had built, the systematic patience of it, the years of it, the way he'd moved through Lucien's life, trusted, essential, indispensable, while constructing something parallel and lethal just below the surface of everything Lucien could see. And then a thought arrived that she hadn't had yet. A cold, precise thought that came with the particular quality of things that are obvious only after the angle shifts. "Lucien." Her voice was quiet. "The assassination attempt. 3 years before Marcus died. The one at the South Harbor that Marcus pulled you out of." Lucien glanced at her. "Marcus told you that?" "He told me he saved you. He didn't tell me details." "What about it?" "Who set up your schedule for that day?" The silence in the car lasted 4 full seconds. "Roman managed my calendar," Lucien said slowly. "At that point in his tenure, he'd taken over most of my scheduling and logistics. So Roman would have known where you were going to be." Another silence. Longer. "Yes." "And Marcus pulled you out of a car before the second shot." She paused. "One shot. Why did the shooter only fire once? If it was a hired assassin with a position in a window, why fire once and stop?" Lucien's hands shifted on the wheel. He didn't answer. "Because someone called it off," Celine said. "Someone aborted the attempt. Because Marcus was there, and if Marcus survived, he could identify who'd commissioned it." She looked at Lucien's profile in the dark. "Roman tried to have you killed 3 years before Marcus died. Marcus was collateral damage that would have exposed him. So Roman called it off and waited. And when Marcus found the ledgers 18 months later and went straight to you, Roman moved faster." The car stopped at a red light. There was no other traffic. The light turned green and Lucien didn't move the car for 3 full seconds. Then he drove. "He's been trying to take the organization for over 3 years, Lucien said. "Not from outside, from inside, patient, incremental, using my own infrastructure." He exhaled through his nose. "Everything I built, he's been building inside it, like a second city in the walls of the first." She let that sit, let him carry the weight of it. Then she said, "He's not going to stop." "No." "And now he knows we have the documentation." "Yes." "And he knows we know it's him." "Yes." and he has people inside Ravencrest. Apparently. So Ravencrest isn't safe. No. The North Grid property turned out to be a converted harbor master's building on a decommissioned section of the old port. Stone-built and water-adjacent, accessed through a gate that required a physical key and 2 numeric codes. No cameras on approach. No visible security. The kind of safe house that looked like nothing from the outside because it had been built to look like nothing. Not a fortress, not a compound, just an old building that had been forgotten at the edge of a city's industrial memory. Inside, heat, basic furniture, a working kitchen, a secure server terminal. Lucien sat Celine at the main table with the laptop case and a cup of strong coffee and connected the sealed laptop to the terminal. Marcus's documentation opened in its entirety. They spent 3 hours going through it. The encrypted ledgers, the audio recordings, Roman's voice, unmistakable, discussing Riviera payment schedules in a flat, businesslike tone that was more damning than anger would have been. The paper trail connecting Roman's shell companies to cartel funds through 6 layers of financial obfuscation that Marcus had patiently unraveled one thread at a time. And at the end of the 3rd audio file, something neither of them had been expecting. Roman's voice, recorded in a location Celine didn't recognize, speaking to a person whose voice was distorted, electronically modified, careful. "The girl is the problem," Roman said on the recording. "If she ever clears her head enough to go through his things, the whole structure falls. We need her contained." The distorted voice said something about timeline. "The boyfriend is fine for now," Roman said. "But if she starts asking questions, if she starts connecting anything, we move to permanent." The word permanent landed in the room like a stone in still water. Celine sat very still. She was aware of her own breathing, slow, measured, the deliberate breath of someone who is deciding something. The coffee cup was in her right hand, and she set it down carefully on the table because her right hand had started, very slightly, to shake. Not with fear. With the specific fury of someone who has just been told, in their dead brother's handwriting and a recorded voice, that they were supposed to disappear. That the plan had always been disposal. That 3 years of her life, 3 years of a bathroom floor and split lips, and a man who hit her, had been considered an acceptable holding pattern until she could be removed more cleanly. Lucien was watching her. He hadn't spoken since the recording ended. He was giving her the space to have whatever response was coming, which she understood as a form of respect, even through the fury. "Permanent," she said. "Yes." "He was going to have me killed. When it became necessary, yes." She looked at the laptop screen. The cursor blinked on the last line of the audio transcript. "You told me last night," she said, "that you owed a debt to Marcus's name. That bringing me to Ravencrest was the least you could do." "Yes." "Is it still a debt, or is it something else now?" Lucien was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, considering. She'd started to learn the difference. "It's something else now," he said. "What?" He met her eyes across the table. In the functional light of the safe house, without the polished surfaces and the institutional grandeur of Ravencrest, he looked stripped down and honest in a way that the mansion hadn't permitted. "A responsibility," he said. "A real one. Not something I inherited from your brother's death. Something I'm choosing." She held his gaze. The anger was still there. It wasn't going anywhere. It had too much structural mass to dissipate in a single night. But underneath the anger, under the grief and the exhaustion, and the 3-year accumulation of deliberate damage that Roman Viscari had commissioned, something else had been growing since the moment she'd pressed that call button on a bathroom floor. A spine, or the rediscovery of one. "Then, here's what I need from you," she said. "Full access. Not managed information. Not what you decide I can handle. Everything." She put both palms flat on the table. "I am not a liability to be protected. I am the person who has the documentation and the motivation, and apparently nothing left to lose. So either we do this together, completely, or I walk out of this building right now and do it myself, and probably get killed, and Roman wins anyway." The offer sat between them. Lucien looked at her for a long time. She watched his jaw, watched the tension move through it, and then, slowly, release. Not fully, not to comfort, but to something adjacent to decision. He reached across the table and turned the laptop so they were both looking at the screen. "The recording," he said. The distorted voice. "I know who it is." Celine leaned forward. "It's not just Roman," Lucien said. "Roman has a partner inside the city structure. Someone with the authority to call off police investigations, redirect city resources, seal records." He paused. "Someone who's been insulating Roman's operation from above while Roman built it from below." "Who?" Lucian's expression was the specific expression of a man about to say something that will change the shape of everything that follows. "Commissioner Hartwell," he said, "the head of Blackwater's organized crime division, the man whose office had conducted the investigation into Marcus Vale's death, the man who had declared the case cold, the man who, for 5 years, had been the primary obstacle between every criminal organization in Blackwater City and the law that was supposedly hunting them." Celine sat back in her chair. The full architecture of it assembled itself in her mind slowly, piece by piece, the way a city looks when you climb high enough to see its whole shape at once. The streets that look random from street level resolving into an intentional grid from above. Roman in the organization. Hartwell above it. Marcus finding the seam between them. Marcus dying for it. And Celine Vale, invisible, broken, contained in a Narrows apartment for 3 years, never knowing she was sitting on the only surviving documentation that could bring the whole structure down. Outside, the pre-dawn sky had begun its transformation from black to the particular dark blue that precedes gray. Somewhere in the harbor, a foghorn sounded once. She looked at Lucien. "How do we move against both of them at the same time?" she said, without either one warning the other. Lucien opened his mouth to answer, and then his phone lit up on the table between them. The screen showed a single text from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words. "Ravencrest is gone. Evacuate." Followed, 3 seconds later, by a second message. "Elena is dead." Lucien stared at the screen. The muscle in his jaw went rigid. His hand came down flat on the table with a controlled force that was more frightening than any explosion of anger would have been, because it meant he was absorbing this. The death of a woman who had worked for him for 9 years, the destruction of his home, the full escalation of Roman's timetable, and converting it directly into resolve. He looked up. His pale eyes had gone to something past anger, past grief, to the territory that exists on the other side of both. The cold, stripped-down clarity of a man who has run out of things to protect and arrived at the only thing left. "Now," he said quietly. And Celine understood that the war they'd been approaching for 2 days had just arrived, and that there was no longer any question of readiness or strategy or the luxury of more time. There was only what came next, and the people who were still standing when it ended, and somewhere beneath the dark blue pre-dawn sky of Blackwater City, Roman Viscari was already moving his pieces into their final positions. Lucien was on his 3rd call before Celine had finished her coffee. She listened to him work. Not the content. He switched languages twice, dropped into codes she couldn't follow, but the quality of it, the velocity, the way he moved through each call with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this contingency without ever expecting to use it, pulling assets from compartments Roman had never been given access to, reaching out to men whose loyalty had been built on foundations Roman had never touched. She watched his face and saw something she hadn't seen in it before. Not fear, not panic, but a kind of terrible focus. The expression of a man who has stripped everything away and arrived at the irreducible center of what he is and what he's capable of. By the time he set the phone down, the sky outside the harbor master's windows had gone from dark blue to the gray-white of early dawn. 6 calls. 11 minutes. "We have until tonight," he said. "Why tonight?" "Because Roman needs to move before I can regroup. He's burned Ravencrest. He's eliminated Elena as an information source. He knows we have the documentation." He stood up from the table and went to the kitchen, came back with water, drank half of it standing. "His window is the next 12 hours. After that, I've pulled enough of my separate assets that he loses the advantage. So we draw him out before then. We give him a reason to come to us on our terms." Celine turned the coffee cup in her hands. "The documentation. If he believes we're moving it to an outside party tonight, a federal contact, a journalist, someone who can publish it before he can suppress it, he has to move. He can't wait." "Does he have a federal contact, someone who can intercept?" Hartwell, Lucian said. Hartwell can block a federal filing for 24 hours through administrative channels. That's Roman's insurance. But if the documentation reaches someone outside Hartwell's jurisdiction, a federal prosecutor in another district, a major press outlet with national reach, Hartwell loses his ability to contain it. So we make Roman believe we're taking it out of Blackwater. Yes. And Hartwell? Lucy Yen's expression went to that still, considered place. Hartwell is being handled separately. I have a contact at the federal level, someone Roman and Hartwell don't know about, someone I've maintained for exactly the kind of situation where my own city's law enforcement cannot be trusted. He set the water glass down. He's been briefed. He'll have federal marshals at Hartwell's office by noon. That's 6 hours. Yes. Can Roman move against us in 6 hours? He can try. She looked at him across the table in the gray morning light. He'd cleaned the cut on his temple with the first aid kit she'd found under the kitchen sink. It was closed now, a thin dark line above his cheekbone that would probably scar. He'd changed into a dark shirt from a go bag stored in the safe house's utility closet. He looked functional and capable and completely, absolutely committed to whatever was about to happen. She thought about Elena. 9 years of service and a text message in 4 words. She thought about Marcus pressing a flash drive into Lucian's hand at the docks, his jaw set, his eyes carrying fear he was trying not to show. She thought about 3 years on a bathroom floor. "What do you need me to do?" she said. The message went out at 7:45 in the morning, sent from a number Roman didn't recognize but could trace if he had the resources, which he did. The message was constructed to be found. Not immediately obvious, but discoverable within 90 minutes to a man with Roman's intelligence infrastructure. It referenced a meeting with a federal prosecutor named Carver in the West Side District at 9 p.m., named the documentation specifically, and was addressed to Luce Yen from a sender identified only as DC office. By 8:30, one of Lucien's separated assets reported that Roman had made 6 calls in 40 minutes and activated 4 of his mercenary teams. He'd taken the bait completely. The location they chose was the Meridian Terminal, an abandoned shipping facility on the city's western harbor that had been decommissioned 3 years earlier after a fire destroyed its primary processing warehouse. What remained was a skeleton, corrugated steel walls, concrete floors cracked and heaved by freeze-thaw cycles, enormous loading bays open to the harbor wind, catwalks of industrial steel suspended 40 feet above the ground floor, and a maze of cargo containers that had been left in place when the facility closed, rusting slowly into permanence. It was a place where visibility was controlled by whoever understood the layout. Lucien understood the layout. He'd owned the terminal through a holding company for 2 years, acquired quietly, its purpose on paper listed as pending redevelopment. They arrived at 11 in the morning with 8 men. The 6 Lucien had called in from his separated units, plus 2 who materialized at the Harbor Master's building at 9 a.m. without announcement, men whose names Celine wasn't given and didn't ask for. They spent 4 hours positioning. Each man was placed with a sightline and a fallback route. The catwalks were checked for structural integrity. The 3 primary entry points were identified, surveilled, and staggered with tripwire indicators that would give 4 seconds warning. Lucien walked Celine through the layout twice. She memorized it the way she'd memorized the storage facility map. Not perfectly, but well enough that in the dark and the noise and the disorientation of actual crisis, her body would know where to go without her brain needing to direct it. He gave her a handgun at 3 in the afternoon, a compact 9mm, already loaded, safety on. He showed her twice how the safety worked. She didn't tell him that Marcus had shown her how to shoot when she was 16 in a field outside the city on a Sunday afternoon, and that her hands knew the weight of a loaded weapon already. She just listened and nodded and checked the chamber when he was done. "You don't use this unless there is no other option," Lucien said. "I know. I mean it." "So do I." He looked at her. That quality of assessment, of careful measurement, that she'd come to recognize as his version of something other people expressed more overtly. "You can still get out," he said. "The documentation exists. The federal contact has a copy now. You've already done what Marcus needed done. You don't have to be here for the—" "Don't," she said, quietly, but with an edge that stopped him cleanly. "Don't give me the option to leave like it's a kindness. I know what it is." "What is it?" It's you trying to manage the liability. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. It is. And also it's... He stopped, started again. You've already lost more than you should have. I don't want to be another thing that costs you. She heard the honesty in it, sat with it for a moment. Then make sure we both walk out, she said. He nodded once, turned back to the terminal layout. Roman's people came at 9:17 p.m. Not at 9 exactly. Roman wasn't predictable in his timing, a professional habit. They came 17 minutes past the specified meeting time, entering through all 3 access points simultaneously, which told Lucian that Roman had done his own reconnaissance on the facility and understood that a single entry point was a trap. He'd split his force, 4 through the main loading bay, 3 through the south service entrance, 3 more through a compromised section of the west wall that Lucian's people had pre-identified and left deliberately undefended, understanding Roman would find it and use it, and that using it would commit that portion of his force to a corridor with one exit. Celine was positioned on the first-level catwalk, 15 feet above the main floor, behind a section of structural steel that gave her a clear sightline down to the central clearing between the container rows. She could hear everything. The wind off the harbor coming through the open loading bays, the creak of old steel adjusting to the night temperature, and then, cutting through all of it, the sound of boots on concrete. Below her, in the central clearing, Lucian stood alone. He'd insisted on that. Standing in the open, visible, the single figure in a cleared space surrounded by darkness and container shadows. The documentation, the laptop, the notebook, a printed summary Celine had helped compile at the safe house, was in a case beside his feet. She watched him stand there and felt something move through her that she didn't have a precise word for. It wasn't admiration exactly, it was closer to recognition, the specific kind that happens when you see someone be completely, uncomplicatedly what they are. The first of Roman's men emerged from the container rows to the east, black tactical gear, suppressed weapon raised. Then a second. Then 2 more from the south approach. They fanned out in a practiced semicircle, keeping distance, using each other's coverage angles. Professional, expensive. And then Roman Viscari walked into the light. He came through the main loading bay with 3 men at his back and moved into the central clearing with the ease of someone entering a room where he expected to be in charge. He was dressed in tactical gear that had been tailored, which said everything about his priorities. Even preparing for violence, Roman cared about the presentation. His dark eyes moved across the clearing with that same quick cataloging sweep she'd seen in the courtyard at Ravencrest. He stopped 12 feet from Lucian. "You picked a dramatic location," Roman said. His voice was exactly as it had been at Ravencrest. Easy, warm, the warmth of a man who had learned that warmth was the most effective camouflage. "I picked one I know," Lucian said. "Smart." Roman looked at the case beside Lucian's feet. Something moved in his face, a brief, tightly controlled flicker of hunger. "Is that all of it?" "Everything Marcus compiled. Original files, documentation, audio recordings." Lucian's voice was perfectly flat. "Including the recording of your conversation about permanent measures for Celine Vale." Roman absorbed that without visible reaction. "I'd like to have it back." "I imagine you would." A silence. Wind through the loading bay, lifting grit off the concrete floor and dispersing it into the dark. "You know how this ends," Roman said. "Whatever you've already sent to your federal contact. Hartwell manages that. He has the jurisdiction and the relationships. Any filing out of Blackwater gets routed through his office. It dies there." He tilted his head slightly. "You've played this hand very well, Lucian, but it's still a losing hand." "Hartwell is in federal custody," Lucian said. "As of 40 minutes ago." The warmth left Roman's face. Not dramatically, not all at once. It drained out of his expression the way heat drains from a surface when the source is removed, slowly, in stages, until what was underneath was exposed. What was underneath was not anger and not fear, but something older and colder than either. The expression of a man who has been running a long game and just watched the board reset. "You're lying," Roman said. "Commissioner Hartwell was taken into federal custody at 8:42 p.m. by a team operating under a sealed warrant from the Eastern District. The warrant was filed 6 hours ago from outside Blackwater's jurisdiction. Hartwell's administrative protections dissolved the moment the marshals put him in the vehicle. Lucian paused. I've been building that contact for 7 years. Before you joined my organization. Before you became someone I trusted. The word trusted landed between them like something physical. Roman was quiet for 3 full seconds. She watched his face from above, watched the recalculation happening behind his eyes, the collapse of the Hartwell insurance, the exposure of the documentation, the sealed facility around him with its container shadow corridors that he'd scoped but perhaps not scoped carefully enough. I've been with you 8 years, Roman said finally. His voice had changed. The warmth was gone, and what replaced it was something more direct, and in its directness almost more dangerous. The voice of a man who has decided to stop performing. 8 years? Before that? Your father. I was loyal to this organization for 12 years total. I know. Everything you built after your father died. The port contracts, the city council relationships, the federal insulation, the expansion north. I built that with you. I was in every room. I was present for every decision. I know, Lucian said again. And then the Riviera approached me. Roman's voice stayed level. And they offered a structure that made sense. A business arrangement. The port was going to be contested regardless. The Riviera had the resources to contest it indefinitely. Partnering was rational. It was, you killed Marcus Vale. The sentence cut through everything Roman was building. Flat, absolute, delivered without heat, which made it more devastating than rage would have been. Roman's jaw tightened. Marcus found something he shouldn't have found, Roman said. He found the truth. He brought it to me. And you had him killed in my warehouse before I could read the drive he gave me. Lucian's voice was still controlled, but underneath the control, something was moving, something pressurized, looking for the seam. He trusted the organization enough to bring it up the chain. He trusted me, and you took him before that trust could mean anything. He would have dismantled everything. He would have given me the chance to make a decision about my own organization. Something shifted in Lucian's voice, not breaking, sharpening. That's what you took from me. Not the partnership, not the leverage. The chance to know what was happening in something I built. You took that from Marcus. You took 5 years from his sister, and you stood in my house for 2 days knowing what you knew, and you smiled, and you called me by my first name, and you asked about security rotations. Roman said nothing. How long? Lucian said. Before Marcus, before the Riviera. How long were you building the exit? 3 years, Roman said quietly. The assassination attempt at the South Harbor. Yes. The word fell into the clearing like a stone. Celine's grip on the catwalk railing tightened until her knuckles ached. She'd known it theoretically, had assembled it logically in the safe house. But hearing Roman say yes with that flat, tired honesty was different from knowing it. It made it real in a way that logic couldn't. Below, she could see Lucien absorb it. The way it moved through him, not outward, not in expression, but in the subtle shift of his posture, the millimeter change in how he was holding his body. 3 years. Roman had been trying to remove him for 3 years, had failed, and had spent the intervening years building the alternative structure more carefully. We can still find an arrangement, Roman said. The warmth was trying to come back. It didn't make it. The documentation is out, I understand that. But there are degrees, there are negotiations. You need to think about what a war costs both. The gunshot came from the East Corridor, not suppressed. Full report, cracking off the steel walls and echoing through the terminal with the sharp, bouncing chaos of sound in enclosed industrial space. 1 shot, then a burst of 3. Then a sustained exchange that told Celine that Lucian's people in the East Corridor had made contact with Roman's West Wall team and the containment had broken. Roman moved in the same instant, a trained, immediate response, dropping low, putting his closest man between himself and the sound, hand going to the sidearm at his hip. Lucien moved too. Not away. Forward. Closing the 12 feet between them in 3 strides before Roman's man could properly position, driving into Roman with a shoulder impact that knocked both of them off balance and sent the sidearm skittering across concrete. The clearing erupted. Roman's flanking men raised weapons and were met immediately by fire from 3 positions. Lucien's people, positioned in the container shadows, who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The tactical geometry of the space, which Lucien had spent 4 hours constructing, paid out in 3 seconds. Two of Roman's men went down. A third took cover behind a container, returned fire, was flanked. Celine left the catwalk. She went down the service ladder at the east end, dropping the last 6 feet because the bottom rungs had corroded free, landing hard on her left ankle, the same one she'd twisted 2 nights ago, and feeling the bolt of pain go up through her knee and hip with a bright, nauseating clarity. She landed and kept moving because stopping was not an option, because the ankle would hold or it wouldn't, and in either case she was moving. The main floor was chaos. Gunfire from 3 directions, the detonation of sound off steel and concrete creating an acoustic fog that made directionality unreliable. She moved through it using the container rows for cover, working toward the central clearing, the 9mm in both hands, the way Marcus had shown her, muzzle down, safety off. She cleared the last container row and came into the edge of the clearing. Lucien and Roman were fighting on the ground. Not the contained technical combat of trained men working in space. This was something rawer. 2 people who had known each other for 8 years trying to destroy each other in a way that contained something beyond strategy. It had the quality of old grief expressed through violence, of betrayal finding its physical resolution. Roman was bigger in close quarters than he'd looked at Ravencrest. He fought like someone who'd trained extensively and had the additional advantage of genuine fury. The fury of a long game collapsing, of a structure years in the making reduced in a single night. He got a hand free from Lucien's grip and drove an elbow into Lucien's already cut temple, and Lucien's head snapped sideways and he lost a half-second of orientation. Roman went for the dropped sidearm. Celine stepped into the clearing. "Stop!" Her voice came out level and clear above the gunfire echoing from the corridors. She stood with the 9mm raised in both hands, muzzle on Roman's center mass, 15 feet of concrete between them. Her left ankle was screaming. Her arms were steady. Roman froze with his hand 3 inches from the sidearm. He turned his head and looked at her. His face was cut across the cheekbone, and his breathing was ragged, and there was blood on his collar. He looked at the gun in her hands, and then he looked at her face, and something moved in his expression. A recalibration, a new assessment. "You're not going to shoot me," he said. "Try me." "You've never—" "I grew up in this city with nothing," she said. "I survived 3 years in that apartment. I watched my brother get buried without knowing the truth, and I spent 5 years being managed and reduced and contained by people who were afraid of what I might figure out." Her voice was quiet and absolute. "So no. I don't have the specific experience you're thinking of, but I have enough." Roman looked at her for 2 full seconds. Then his eyes moved, just slightly, just a fraction, to something behind her right shoulder. She didn't turn. She held position and trusted the instinct that said turning was what he needed her to do. Then Lucien hit Roman from the left with enough force to put him into the side of a cargo container. A full-body impact, chest to steel, and the sound Roman made was not a word. His knees buckled. He slid down the container face with his hands dragging, leaving 2 red streaks on the rust. Lucien stood over him, breathing hard, blood running freely from his temple now, the closed cut reopened, and he made no effort to wipe it away. His chest was working with the forceful rhythm of someone who has spent everything. Roman looked up at him from the ground. His face had the specific expression of a man taking stock of exactly how far he'd fallen. "Finish it," Roman said. Low, not asking, stating, the voice of a professional who understands the logic of the situation and accepts the outcome. Lucien looked at him. The gun was in his hand now. He'd recovered it from the floor during the last exchange. His arm was fully extended, muzzle level with Roman's forehead, and the expression on his face was the most honest thing Celine had ever seen on a human face. Not rage, not satisfaction, not justice. Just the utter exhausted grief of a man about to do something that will cost him a piece of himself he will never get back. His finger moved inside the trigger guard, and Celine said, "Don't." Lucien's eyes cut to her. Quick, sharp. "If you do that," she said, "the documentation is just documentation. There's no testimony, no cooperation agreement, no chain of evidence that leads up the chain beyond him." She kept her voice steady. Every instinct in her wanted Roman dead, wanted it with a clean, absolute certainty she'd never felt about anything. She could feel the want of it in her hands and her jaw and the sustained pressure behind her sternum. He has names, contacts. Every person in the Riviera structure he was connected to, Every politician Hartwell ever protected. All of it. She held Lucien's gaze. You pull that trigger, you get one man. You don't pull it, you get all of them. The terminal had gone quiet. The gunfire in the corridors had stopped. Lucien's men were moving in from the perimeter, and the sounds they made were cleanup sounds. The sounds of an engagement that had reached its conclusion everywhere except in this clearing, where two men and a woman stood in the artificial dark and tried to find the version of this ending that cost the least. Lucien's arm was still extended. Roman hadn't moved. He sat against the container with his hands visible and his eyes on Lucien and waited with a stillness that was almost impressive. The stillness of a man who had made his choices and was no longer afraid of the consequences, because the consequences were here. She's right, Roman said quietly. It was the most honest thing he'd said all night. You know she's right. Lucien's jaw worked. The gun didn't move. Celine watched his face and saw the war in it. The man who had built something over 20 years and had it hollowed out by the person he trusted most, trying to find the version of himself that could make the right decision when the wrong one was right there, available, deserved. His arm lowered. Not all the way. Not to his side. He kept the weapon up but dropped the firing angle, pointing at Roman's chest rather than his skull. Still lethal at this range, but no longer an execution. You're going to give everything, Lucien said. Every name, every account, every transaction, every person you protected, and everyone who protected you. His voice was rough and flat and carried the specific tone of a man whose negotiating position is backed by the absolute willingness to change his mind. And if one name is missing, one account, one person who walks because you protected them, I revisit this decision. Roman held his gaze. Understood, Roman said. From somewhere north of the terminal, the sound arrived, distant at first. Building. Sirens. Multiple. Moving fast. Not city police. Federal frequencies, the specific wail that Lucien had coordinated through his outside contact, timed to arrive 30 minutes after the engagement was expected to conclude. 30 minutes. They'd used 28. Celine lowered her gun. Her arms were shaking now. Not from weakness, from the effort of sustained adrenaline, the aftermath of holding a firing position for 3 minutes while her ankle delivered steady updates about its structural complaints. She lowered the weapon and stood in the middle of the Meridian terminal with the harbor wind coming through the open loading bays and the smell of gunpowder and cold salt air and rust, and she breathed. Just breathed. Lucien turned to look at her across the clearing. His face was blood-streaked and exhausted and, for the first time since she'd met him, completely without calculation. No mask. No management. Just the stripped-down face of a man who had come to the end of something and was standing in the ruin of it, trying to figure out what was still standing. She looked back at him, the gun at her side, the notebook against her ribs. Outside, the sirens were getting closer. And in the ruins of the Meridian terminal, with 8 of Lucien's men securing Roman's mercenaries in the container corridors and the harbor's black water moving 40 feet below the terminal's west wall, something that had been in motion for 5 years was the federal vehicles came through the terminal's main gate at 9:41 p.m., 6 of them. Black SUVs and 2 unmarked sedans moving in the coordinated pattern of a team that had been briefed on the location and the expected conditions. They came without the theatrical urgency of city police. No lights once they were inside the gate. No shouting. Just doors opening and agents moving into positions with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the noise had already happened, and what was required now was documentation. Celine stood against the exterior wall of the terminal's secondary office block, a low concrete structure attached to the main building's east face, out of the primary flow of the federal team's movement. Her left ankle had been elevated on a shipping pallet for the last 20 minutes, and the swelling had climbed above the boot line, pushing against the leather with a steady, insistent pressure that she was managing by not looking at it directly. The 9mm was back on safe, held loosely at her side. She watched the agents work, watched them move through the terminal with evidence bags and cameras, watched them manage the zip-tied mercenaries in the container corridors, watched the 2 agents who emerged from the south entrance carrying Roman Viscari between them, not roughly, not gently, with the practiced neutrality of people for whom this was procedural rather than personal. Roman walked without resistance. His hands were secured behind him, and his face was closed, composed, the expression of a man who had already made a decision about how to carry what was happening. He didn't look towards Celine as they passed. She wasn't sure if that was strategy or something else. Lucian stood 10 feet away from her, talking in a low voice to a man in a dark jacket who was clearly the lead federal agent, mid-40s, gray at the temples, the specific kind of unremarkable face that suggested considerable intelligence operating deliberately behind it. His name was Reeves. He shook Lucian's hand with the familiarity of two people who had maintained a professional relationship across a long distance and a careful trust. She couldn't hear what they were saying. She watched Lucien's hands while they talked, the controlled gestures, the precise economy of movement. His temple had been taped by one of his men using the terminal's emergency kit. The blood had been cleaned from his face, but not entirely. There were shadows of it at his jawline and collar that hadn't come fully clean, and she found herself looking at those shadows and thinking about the distance between the man who had walked into the Greystone apartments 2 nights ago in a charcoal overcoat and the man standing under industrial lights with tape on his face and 8 years of betrayal still processing somewhere behind his pale eyes. 2 nights. It had been 2 nights. She'd lived more in 48 hours than in the 3 years before them combined. Agent Reeves came to her eventually. He crouched beside the pallet where her ankle rested, which she appreciated. He didn't make her stand, didn't perform authority at her, just came down to her level and introduced himself with a directness that she found, after everything, deeply refreshing. Ms. Vale, I'm going to need a statement. Not tonight. Tonight you need a hospital and sleep, in whatever order the hospital recommends. He had a dry, flat delivery that suggested he'd been doing this long enough that urgency had been replaced by precision. We have the documentation. We have the audio recordings. We have Mr. Vescari in custody, and Commissioner Hartwell has been formally charged. Your statement will be important for the prosecution, but it's not time-sensitive. What happens to Roman? She asked. He's indicated willingness to cooperate. Given the scope of what we're looking at, the Riviera connections, the financial network, the police corruption, the federal prosecutor will likely structure a cooperation agreement. He provides names, accounts, organizational intelligence. In exchange, his charges are reduced from the maximum exposure. He ordered my brother's murder. Yes, that charge doesn't get reduced. Reeves met her eyes with a steadiness that wasn't comfort, but was its own kind of solidity. Marcus Vale's homicide is a separate count. It stays at the top of the indictment regardless of any cooperation agreement on the financial charges. She sat with that. The wind off the harbor moved through the loading bay and crossed the terminal floor and found her where she sat, cold and purposeful, lifting the loose hair at her temple. Okay, she said. She didn't feel the way she'd expected to feel. She'd spent 2 days anticipating this moment, or some version of it, some resolution-shaped event at the end of the tunnel, and had imagined it would feel like relief, or like the sharp release of a pressure that had been building for 5 years. Instead, it felt like the moment after a very long run when you stop moving and the full weight of your exhaustion arrives all at once. Not empty, just heavy. The specific weight of something that is finally, actually over. Agent Reeves left her with a business card and a promise about the hospital. She tucked the card into her jacket pocket where it pressed against Marcus's notebook. The hospital visit lasted 4 hours. The ankle was a moderate sprain, not a fracture. The attending physician seemed mildly skeptical of this given the swelling, ordered an X-ray, was proven right, and wrapped it with the efficient disappointment of a man whose diagnosis had been correct and who found no satisfaction in correctness at 2 a.m. She had the split lip assessed, the bruising around her eye documented, a mild concussion ruled out. She was given an anti-inflammatory, a compression bandage, a pair of crutches she refused to take with her when she left, and instructions to stay off the ankle for a week that she already knew she wasn't going to follow. Lucien was in the waiting area when she came out. He was sitting in a plastic chair against the wall, forearms on his knees, looking at the floor with the particular stillness of a man who has been sitting in one place for long enough that his body has found a resting state that has nothing to do with comfort. He'd changed. Somewhere in the hours of the federal processing, he'd found clean clothes, a dark jacket, and had done something about the blood at his collar. The tape on his temple had been replaced with a cleaner dressing. He looked up when she came through the door. He stood. Just stood there, which was enough. How bad? He asked. Sprain? Not a break. Good. A silence. The hospital lobby at 2 in the morning had a specific quality of stillness. The fluorescent hum, the distant sound of carts moving on linoleum, a television in the corner showing news on mute. You didn't have to wait, she said. I know. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was nothing performative in either of them at this hour. Nothing managed or calibrated. Just two people who had been through a specific kind of fire together, standing in a hospital lobby trying to figure out what the aftermath looked like. Where are you going? She asked. I have a property in the North District. An apartment. Nothing like Ravencrest. Smaller. Quieter. A pause. Ravencrest is a crime scene for the next several weeks. The federal team has access. Do you mind that? He considered it. The building? No. What it represented? He stopped. 8 years of someone I trusted. Everything I built after my father. Roman was in all of it. He looked at the linoleum floor for a moment. I'm going to have to understand everything he touched and what it actually was. That's going to take time. Yes, she said. It is. A quiet that was different from the silences they'd shared over the last 2 days, less weighted, less full of things that hadn't been said yet. Celine, he said her name carefully. I need to tell you something about your brother that I haven't told you yet. She went still. At the South Harbor, he said. The assassination attempt. When Marcus pulled me out of the car before the second shot. He didn't just pull me out. He took the shot. He paused, and in the pause she could hear what it cost him to say this. The second bullet was meant for me. It hit Marcus instead. Right shoulder. He walked me 6 blocks to a secure location, handed me off to my people, and told me it was a graze. Lucien's jaw tightened. It wasn't a graze. He had the wound treated privately, off the books, never told anyone. He walked out of that night like it hadn't happened. Celine stood very still. She was thinking about Marcus at their kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon when she was 17, his right shoulder rolled slightly forward, the way he'd always held it. She'd thought it was a habit, a posture thing. He never said anything, she said. No. Not to me. Not to anyone. No. She breathed. In through her nose, slow, the way you breathe when you're managing something that needs to be managed rather than expressed. He was protecting you, she said. Yes. He spent 3 years protecting you, and then he spent the last months of his life trying to get you the truth about the person who tried to have you killed. She said it without accusation, just assembling it, laying it out, looking at the shape of her brother's choices. He loved this organization. He believed in what you were trying to build. I know. Lucien's voice had something in it that hadn't been there before. A roughness that wasn't controlled, that was the actual texture of something he was feeling rather than a managed expression of it. And I failed to protect what he put that faith in. I let Roman exist inside it. I chose trust over vigilance because Roman was useful and comfortable, and I didn't want to look at what was right in front of me. You didn't know. I should have. That's not how it works, Celine said. You can't know what someone is hiding if they're good enough at hiding it. Roman was very good at it. That's not an excuse. It's not an excuse. It's just true. She paused. Marcus didn't blame you for it. He tried to fix it for you. That means he understood the difference between your failure and your responsibility. Lucien looked at her. Something in his face moved, an expression she hadn't seen on him before, brief and raw, gone quickly because a man like Lucien didn't leave those expressions in place for long. He'd be furious about what happened to you, Lucien said. The 3 years, Garrett, all of it. I know. He'd want me to... He stopped. I don't want to speak for him. He'd want you to make sure I'm okay, she said. And then he'd want me to take care of myself. That was his consistent position on every subject. She paused. He was frequently right about it. 3 weeks later, the federal case moved with the momentum of something that had been building for a long time and was finally permitted to fall. Roman Viscari's cooperation began the day after his arrest and proved, as Celine had argued in the terminal, to be considerably more valuable than his death would have been. The names he provided reached into city government, the Port Authority, 2 state-level political offices, and the outer structure of the Riviera Cartel in 4 cities. 41 arrests in the first 2 weeks. Commissioner Hartwell was formally indicted on 11 counts. The organized crime division he'd run for 9 years was dissolved pending investigation, its cases and files handed to a federal oversight committee. Marcus Vale's homicide was officially reclassified from unsolved to prosecuted. Roman Vescari entered a formal plea on the charge. The plea bargain reduced his sentence on the financial counts. It did not reduce the homicide charge. The prosecutor, a woman named Chen, who wore plain suits and asked questions like a scalpel, made sure of that. Celine attended the formal hearing. She sat in the back row of the courtroom with her hands in her lap and watched Roman Vescari stand before the judge and state his plea in a flat, functional voice. He didn't look at her. She looked at him, fully, without flinching, for as long as she needed to. What she felt watching him wasn't satisfaction. She'd been wrong about what this moment would feel like, had spent years, without knowing she was doing it, imagining that justice for Marcus would produce something clean and complete, some resolution that would close the wound properly. What she felt instead was something more complicated, a grief that had finally found its correct shape. 5 years of not knowing had distorted the grief into something formless and pressurized, a misery with no object. Now it had an object. Now it had a name and a courtroom and a charge sheet. That wasn't healing, but it was the beginning of something that might eventually be. She left the courthouse before the session ended. She needed air. Outside, the October sky over Blackwater was the particular gray-blue of late autumn, high thin clouds moving fast over the city's skyline, the light clean and cold. She stood on the courthouse steps with her hands in her jacket pockets and breathed and let the city sound, traffic, voices, the distant pulse of it, move around her. Ms. Vale, she turned. Agent Reeves had come out behind her, hands in his jacket pockets, squinting slightly in the direct light. Mr. Vescari entered the plea. He said, "I know, I was there. You left early. I'd heard enough." He nodded. He stood beside her on the steps and looked out at the street with the companionable lack of urgency of someone who understood that some moments needed to be inhabited rather than moved through. "The homicide charge carries a minimum 22 years, he said. "Given his age and the conditions of federal custody, it's a life sentence in practical terms." "Okay," she said. "I thought you'd want to know." "Thank you." He left her there. She stood a little longer watching the street. Marcus was 26 years old. He would have been 31 now. He would have been... She didn't know exactly. She couldn't know. He'd been changed by what he'd seen in the organization, and she'd never known the full shape of who he was becoming because Roman Vescari had made sure she never got the chance to find out. That was the loss that lived underneath everything else. Not just the death. The future. All the versions of Marcus Vale that had never existed because someone decided his knowledge was more dangerous than his life. She took the notebook from her inside jacket pocket. She'd been carrying it since the storage unit. She turned it over in her hands once, feeling the worn cover, the slight asymmetry where Marcus had pressed too hard with the pen and warped the cardboard. She opened it to the last page. Read the entry one more time. Don't let them make you small. She closed it. She found him at the North District apartment on a Tuesday evening, 3.5 weeks after the terminal. She didn't call ahead. It occurred to her, arriving at the building, that she'd been in contact with Lucien through Agent Reeves, and through a lawyer and through practical necessity, but not directly. Not in person, not since the hospital lobby. The building was what he'd described, nothing like Ravencrest. A 6-story residential block in the northern part of the city, clean without being expensive. The kind of building that housed professionals and quiet people and asked nothing of its residents except the rent. She gave her name to the building's intercom and was buzzed in without comment, which meant he'd been expecting her or had told the building to let her through. The elevator opened on the 5th floor and he was standing in the doorway of the apartment at the end of the hall. Dark clothes, no jacket. He looked different from every version of him she'd encountered before. Not softer, exactly. Stripped. The institutional context of Ravencrest had given him a particular weight and formality that had nothing to do with his personality and everything to do with what that house meant. In this ordinary hallway, without the architecture of the empire around him, he was just a man. A specific, particular man with a healing cut at his temple and tired eyes, and the contained quality of someone who had spent 3 weeks in the hard work of understanding what had been real and what hadn't. "I went to the hearing today," she said. "I know. Reeves told me." Roman entered the plea. "Yes." She stopped 6 feet from the door. They stood in the hallway in the standard light of a residential building, which was about as far from the dramatic lighting of the terminal and the harbor master's building and the Ravencrest study as it was possible to get, and she thought that was probably appropriate. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer it honestly." "All right. The first night, when you answered the phone," she paused, "you said it was a debt. Marcus saved your life. You owed the name Vale." "Yes." "Was that all it was?" He held her gaze. In the ordinary light of the hallway, she could see his face clearly, without the shadows and the crisis light that had been present for everything until now. She watched his jaw, watched the honest response move through him before his mouth caught up with it. "No," he said. She waited. "When you called—" He stopped, started again, more carefully. "When I heard your voice, I knew who you were before you said your name. I'd thought about you, not—" He paused, with the specific hesitation of a man choosing words with great care because the subject matters enough to get right. "Not frequently, but I'd known where you were. I'd kept track from a distance after Marcus died. Not surveillance, I just knew where you were. And when I heard what was in your voice that night, I understood something I'd been not understanding for 5 years. Which was that I had been keeping distance because the distance felt like protection for you, so that my world didn't reach into yours again the way it had reached into Marcus's." He put one hand against the doorframe. "And the call was you telling me the distance hadn't protected anything, that my world had reached into yours regardless, and that the least I could do, the absolute minimum of what I could do, was get in the car." She looked at him. She was very still and very clear-eyed, the way she'd become over the last 3 weeks, the way she suspected she would be for a long time. Not hardened, but precise. Deliberate about what she let in and what she looked at and what she named. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I'm not staying," she said. I'm not walking into something right now. I need time that isn't inside a crisis. I need to find out what I'm actually like when no one is trying to manage me or contain me or have me killed." She paused. "I've been one thing or another my whole life. Someone's sister, someone's girlfriend, someone's liability. I want to find out what I am when I'm just myself." "Yes," he said. "You should. That's going to take a while. I imagine it will. And then, I don't know what then." She said it with an honesty that was, she realized, the most honest she'd been with anyone in years. Possibly the most honest she'd ever been about something that actually mattered. "But I'm not leaving the city, and I'm not disappearing." He looked at her with those pale, still eyes, and in them she saw something she recognized. Not the calculation, not the management, but the thing underneath those. The thing that had been present from the hospital lobby and the harbor master's building and the kitchen at 4 in the morning. Something careful and unglamorous and real. "Good," he said. She nodded, started to turn back toward the elevator. "Celine." She looked back. "What your brother wrote," Lucian said, "in the notebook. I don't know what it said, but I know Marcus. I know the kind of thing he would have wanted you to know." He paused. "Whatever he said, I hope you believe it." She thought about the last entry, the urgency pressed into the paper, the handwriting of a man who knew he might be running out of time and used what time he had to say the thing he needed her to hear. "Don't let them make you small." "I'm working on it," she said. She turned and walked down the hallway to the elevator. Her ankle was still sore. The sprain would take another 2 weeks to fully resolve, the doctor had said, but she walked without favoring it. She pressed the elevator button and stood in the ordinary light of an ordinary hallway in a city that had tried, in 100 ways both deliberate and careless, to make her small. The elevator opened. She stepped inside. 6 months later, Blackwater City looked like a city that had been through something and was still deciding what it was becoming. The Port Authority had been restructured under federal oversight. The old network of accommodations and arrangements that had governed the docks for over a decade dismantled and rebuilt with new personnel and enforced transparency. It was imperfect. No human institution rebuilt in 6 months could be otherwise. But it was honest in a way the previous version had never been, and honesty, even imperfect honesty, was a workable foundation. 43 convictions in the federal case, with 9 more pending. The Riviera cartel's Blackwater operation had been effectively severed from its city infrastructure. They still existed further up the coast. They would regroup eventually because organizations like that always regrouped. But their window in Blackwater had closed. Roman Vescari was in a federal facility 3 states away, in protective custody as befitting a cooperating witness with the quantity of enemies that cooperation had generated. His days had the regulated, colorless rhythm of a man who has traded the life he built for the life he deserved. Whether this constituted justice in the fullest sense was a question that reasonable people answered differently. Celine Vale had an apartment on the 4th floor of a building on Cassidy Street, in the part of the city that was neither the Narrows nor the North District, somewhere in the working middle, where the buildings were solid and the neighbors minded their own business, and the coffee shop on the corner knew her order by the 3rd week. The apartment had 2 rooms and a kitchen, and a window that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that she found, each time it happened, worth stopping for. She had a job, paralegal work at a small firm that handled civil litigation. She'd been offered it by a lawyer who had been tangentially connected to the federal case and who had looked at the way she'd organized and cross-referenced Marcus's documentation and made her an offer before the ink was dry on the final indictment. The work was careful and detailed and rewarding in the specific way that careful, detailed work is rewarding for people who have a precision-oriented mind and have spent years not being allowed to use it. She'd also, in the 6 months, made contact with a grief counselor. She went on Thursday afternoons. It was hard in a different way than the terminal had been hard. No adrenaline, no clear enemy, no physical problem to solve. Just the slow and unglamorous work of processing what had happened and what had been lost and what could still be built in the space that loss had left. She thought about Marcus every day. Not always with grief, sometimes with something closer to argument. The way she argued with him when he was alive. The way people argue with the people they love best because love at that depth is comfortable enough for disagreement. She thought about who he'd been and what he'd chosen, and the part of those choices that had cost him everything, and she tried to hold both things at once, her grief for what was lost and her recognition that Marcus Vale had lived according to his own understanding of what mattered, that he had decided some things were worth the cost, that he had been right about most of them and wrong about keeping it from her, and that she had forgiven him for the wrong part without losing any of her love for the right parts. The flash drive from Lucian's desk had been submitted to the federal case as evidence. Before it was submitted, she'd asked for a copy of the document titled R, not for prosecution purposes, just for herself. Reeves had made it happen. She kept the copy in the notebook, tucked between the last written page and the back cover. She'd read it twice. She didn't need to read it again, she just needed to know it was there. The grave was at Cliffside Memorial on the north edge of the city where the land rose toward the bluffs and the sound of the ocean was constant and present. Marcus had always liked the water, not romantically, not as a symbol, just practically. He'd grown up near it, and it was part of his internal landscape, the way certain sounds become background music for a life. She went on a Sunday morning in early April when the weather had begun its tentative shift toward spring. The kind of morning where the cold was still present but had lost its authority. The air carrying a softness that wasn't warmth yet, but was the memory of warmth, the promise of it. She wore a gray jacket and flat shoes and carried a coffee from the corner place in a paper cup. And she stood at Marcus's grave for a while without saying anything, which was the form of the visits she'd settled into. She didn't need to speak aloud. The speaking happened somewhere interior, in the continuous conversation she carried on with her brother's memory. Not a haunting, not a pathology, just the ongoing relationship between people who have loved each other, reformatted by death into something that moved differently but did not stop moving. She thought about what he'd written. Don't let them make you small. She'd been thinking about what that actually meant, beyond the obvious. Beyond the literal instruction not to let Roman Vescari or Garrett Hale or any particular person reduce her. The deeper request underneath it, which was to live at the full size of herself, to occupy her own life completely, to refuse the various forms of shrinkage that fear and grief and isolation offer as alternatives to the terrifying business of being fully present to your own existence. She was working on it. She thought she was getting better at it. She heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She knew the pace and weight of them, had learned them without intending to, the way you learn the particular sound of someone you've spent time with, the specific rhythm that belongs to one person and no other. She didn't turn. She heard him stop a few feet behind her, respectful of the space. A silence that held the sound of the ocean and the early morning birds and the distant hum of the city waking up. "Elena," she said, "I've been thinking about her." "Yes." His voice was quiet. "So have I. She deserved—" Celine paused. "A better end. She served you well for 9 years, and Roman put her in a position where she couldn't." "I know." What Roman held over her? Over her son, Lucian said. He had a debt connection to one of Roman's sub-operations. Roman used it. Elena was trying to manage it quietly, thought she could control the exposure. A pause. She couldn't, and when she understood what was going to happen, she made one call to warn me, to tell me to move. His voice was flat in the way it got flat when he was controlling something. "That's the text I got in the harbor master's building. She'd made the call to warn me, and Roman's people found out." Celine absorbed that, added Elena to the specific category in her mind of people who had paid a price they shouldn't have had to pay. The category was not small. She was learning to carry it without letting it become the dominant weight. She turned around. He was dressed simply. Dark jacket, no tie. The kind of plain, unpretending clothes she'd come to associate with the version of him that existed outside the institutional context of what he ran. He looked better than he had in the months immediately following the terminal. Still carrying things. He always would, she suspected, because some things don't get put down, only integrated, but carrying them differently, more evenly distributed. He held 2 things. A coffee from the same place she'd gotten hers, he'd remembered, or observed, or both, and a small flat package wrapped in plain paper, held in his other hand with the careful deliberateness of someone transporting something that matters. He offered the coffee first. She took it. "What's that?" she said, nodding at the package. He held it for a moment. Marcus left a photograph with his things in the storage unit. Elena had found it before everything. She'd asked me what to do with it. I kept it. He paused. "I should have given it to you before now. I'm sorry it took this long." She took the package. The paper was taped neatly at the corners. She opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph. Small, printed on regular paper, slightly overexposed the way phone photos were in the years before camera technology made everything crisp. Marcus, mid-20s, at what looked like a waterfront somewhere north of the city. He was laughing, not posed, not for the camera, but genuinely laughing at something outside the frame, his head tilted back slightly, the laugh big enough that it had moved his whole body. Beside him, younger, smaller, in a gray sweater with her hair pulled back, was Celine. 17, maybe 18. Also laughing. She couldn't remember this moment, which meant it had been ordinary. One of the ordinary laughing moments that you don't catalog because you assume there will always be more of them. She looked at it for a long time. "Thank you," she said. She put it inside the notebook carefully against the back cover, the photograph and the last letter together. She looked at the grave, at Marcus's name in clean stone letters, at the date that ended 26 years of a life that had been larger and more deliberate and more brave than she'd known while it was happening. "He would have liked you eventually," she said. "He would have fought with you about everything first. He had strong opinions about how people in your position use their power, and he was not diplomatic about sharing them." She paused. "But he would have come around." "I know," Lucian said. "He told me as much. Once." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the grave with an expression that was more open than she'd seen him allow himself in public. The actual face of whatever he felt, unmanaged, available. He said, "He told me once, toward the end, that he thought I was someone worth working for." Lucian's jaw tightened briefly. "That he believed the organization could be something. That he wanted to see what it looked like when it was actually what I said it was." "He meant it," Celine said. "I know he meant it. That's why it cost what it cost." The morning light had strengthened while they stood there, the pale, tentative spring light that comes with early April, and the city below the bluff was coming fully awake in the way cities always do. Imperfect, loud, full of the specific vitality of a place that has survived its own damage and kept going regardless. She'd been told, by the grief counselor, and by time, and by the simple accumulation of days since the terminal, that there was no clean ending to the kind of loss she was carrying. That grief didn't resolve the way a story resolved. It integrated. It found a place to live that wasn't the center of everything, and became eventually one of the many things that made you who you were. She believed that. She was beginning to live it. She looked at Lucien beside her, not at the complicated arithmetic of everything they were to each other, the debt and the history and the shared experience of 48 extraordinary hours and 6 months of careful, respectful distance. Just at him, the specific person. "I'm having dinner on Friday," she said. "At that place on Harbor North that Elena recommended before everything. I've been meaning to go since the fall, and I keep not going." He looked at her. "I thought I might not go alone," she said. In the morning light on the bluff above the ocean, with the city breathing below them, and Marcus Vale's name in clean stone, and the photograph tucked against the last letter her brother had written for her, Lucien Moretti looked at Celine Vale and the calculation. The management, the careful institutional distance, was entirely absent from his face. "Friday," he said. She nodded, turned back to the grave one last time, said silently the things that were hers alone to say. Then she put her hand briefly, lightly, against the top of the headstone. A touch that was not ceremony, not performance, just contact. Just the physical acknowledgement of presence and of loss, and of the continuing responsibility to live in a way that honored both. She stepped back. The ocean moved below the bluff, steady and indifferent and permanent, the way it had moved before any of them existed and would move long after. The city carried on its vast, imperfect noise. The April light fell across the cemetery, and the water and the face of a woman who had been small for a long time and was learning, one Thursday afternoon and one ordinary morning and one deliberate step at a time, what it felt like to take up the full space of herself. She walked back down the path, not toward anything finished, toward what came next, and that, she had learned, was enough.